I had been planning to take a short break away from the noise of the city for months. My job kept me locked in an endless routine, and the thought of being somewhere far, where I could hear my own thoughts, felt like the only thing I was looking forward to. I found a listing for a small cabin on a rental site. The photos showed a weathered wooden structure with a steep roof and a porch that faced a stretch of pine forest. The cabin was said to be about 5 miles from the nearest paved road, and the description boasted complete isolation. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took almost 4 hours. I left late in the morning so I could arrive in the daylight. The road leading up to the place narrowed the further I went. The trees closed in on both sides, their branches twisting overhead like a tunnel. My car's tires crunched over gravel, and I could see where rainwater had carved ruts through the dirt in some places. It felt quiet in a way that wasn't just sound. The air itself seemed still. When I pulled up in front of the cabin, I stepped out and just stood there for a while. The air smelled of dry pine needles and old wood. The cabin looked smaller than it had in the photos, but also sturdier, like it had been standing for decades. The boards were gray with age, and the porch steps sagged in the middle. There was a small stack of firewood under an overhang to the left, and to the right, a rusty metal barrel stood near the tree line. I couldn't hear any distant roads or voices, just the faint rustle of the pines in the breeze. Inside, the cabin was simple. One large room made up most of it, with a narrow door leading to a bathroom in the back. The main room had a small wood stove, a bed pushed up against the far wall, and a table with 2 chairs. The floor creaked in some spots. There was no power, only a couple of battery-powered lamps and a small shelf of candles. The kitchen area was just a counter with a propane camp stove and a few metal pots. I unpacked slowly, setting my backpack by the bed and putting my food supplies in a cooler. I'd brought simple things: canned beans, bread, a few apples, and a pack of bottled water. I had no reason to leave the cabin once I settled in, and that was part of the plan. I wanted to stay put and let the days pass quietly. The first few hours went by peacefully. I walked a short way into the forest behind the cabin, just enough to get a feel for my surroundings. The pines grew thick, their trunks straight and narrow, with a carpet of brown needles underneath. Here and there, I saw fallen logs covered in green moss. The forest floor was uneven, dotted with rocks and small mounds. I noticed how quickly the light dimmed under the trees, even though it was only early afternoon. When I returned, I stacked a few logs by the wood stove. The air had cooled slightly, and I knew it would get colder at night. I lit one of the battery lamps and set it on the table. As the sun went down, the shadows stretched across the porch, and the light outside turned a deep orange. By the time darkness settled, the world outside had turned completely black. There were no distant glows from towns, no headlights from passing cars, just the darkness and the faint sound of wind in the trees. That night, I lay in bed listening to the silence. I'm used to some kind of background noise when I sleep, whether it's the hum of traffic or a neighbor's TV. Here, the stillness was so deep it made every small sound stand out. The creak of the wood stove as it cooled, the occasional pop from the fire, even my own breathing. All of it felt sharper somehow. Somewhere past midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A slow, deliberate crunch of dry needles underfoot. At first, I thought it might be a branch falling, but then it happened again, spaced out like footsteps. I stayed still in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound didn't move closer, but it didn't fade either. Just a step, then another. The spacing between them felt too regular to be an animal scurrying around. It was measured. After maybe a minute, it stopped completely. I waited, my ears straining, but the forest went quiet again. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, though it was a restless kind of sleep. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The air was cold, my breath showing in faint clouds. The ground around the cabin looked undisturbed, except for a faint depression in the layer of pine needles about 15 feet from the porch. It wasn't clear enough to be called a footprint, but the needles had definitely been shifted, like something had pressed down and then moved away. I told myself it could have been a deer, though I'd never heard a deer walk like that before. I spent the day reading and writing in a small notebook I'd brought. The quiet was nice again in the daylight, and I managed to shake off the unease from the night before. I made a small fire in the stove as the afternoon cooled, cooked some beans, and sat watching the light fade. That second night, I lay in bed listening again. It was completely still for a long time. Then, sometime after midnight, the sound came again. Slow, deliberate steps through the pine needles. This time, it seemed to circle the cabin. A few steps, then a pause. Another few, then a longer pause. It was as though whoever or whatever it was didn't care about being heard, or maybe didn't think anyone inside was listening. My mouth felt dry, and I realized I was gripping the blanket too tightly. The steps stopped at the front porch. I could hear the faint creak of one of the boards. Then nothing. I didn't move. My heartbeat was so loud it was the only thing I could focus on. I stayed like that until exhaustion finally made me drift into a shallow sleep. In the morning, I opened the door slowly. The porch boards looked normal, but one of the woodpile logs had been knocked to the side. I tried to think of a reason why wind or an animal would do that, but it didn't fit. I considered packing up and leaving, but something stubborn in me wanted to stay. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe I was letting my mind play tricks on me in the dark. The third night, I decided to stay awake. I kept the lamp on low and sat in the chair by the table, watching the dark window. Hours passed in silence. Then, at almost exactly the same time as before, the steps started again. Slow, measured, coming from the side of the cabin. I could feel the small hairs on my arms stand up. The steps moved toward the front porch, just like the night before. But this time, they didn't stop. I heard the faint scrape of something metal, the sound of it sliding over wood. My eyes went to the door latch. The thought hit me that someone might be trying to open it. I stood slowly, heart pounding. The latch stayed in place. After a few moments, the sound stopped. Then, without warning, there was a hard knock, just one, on the door. Not frantic, not rushed, just a single, solid knock. I didn't move for the rest of the night. When morning came, I packed my things. I checked the porch one last time. On the wooden step, right near the edge, there was a small strip of torn fabric caught on a splinter, dark gray, maybe from a jacket. I left it where it was. I locked the door, even though I knew it wouldn't matter much in a place like this, and walked to my car. I didn't look back. The drive out felt different than the drive in. Every turn in the road, every shadow between the trees, felt like it was holding something just out of sight. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway. I never reported it. I never even told anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that single knock in my head, and I wonder how close I came to finding out who or what was out there. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon, just before the sun started to slide down behind the trees. The road to it had been rough the last couple of miles, a mix of loose gravel, potholes, and dirt, twisting its way deep into the forest. My hands were a little stiff from holding the steering wheel so tight, not because the road was dangerous, but because I didn't like how far away I felt from anything else. The trees pressed in close on both sides, tall, dark, and silent. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was holding its breath. The cabin was small. From the outside, it was all weathered wood and a tin roof that had dulled from years of rain and sun. A short set of steps led up to a little porch, and I could see the forest stretching out endlessly behind it. I parked the truck to the side, close enough that I could grab my things without walking far. The air was cool, carrying that damp, earthy smell you get when leaves rot into the soil. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the occasional distant crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the trees. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust. The place had one main room with a kitchen tucked into the corner, a small table, and a couch that sagged in the middle. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. I set my bags down by the couch and stood still for a moment, just listening. I don't know why I always do that in new places. It's like I need to figure out the sound of the place, to learn what's normal before I can settle in. The silence inside was different from outside. Out there, you had the soft rustle of leaves, the distant groan of branches. In here, There was nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional soft creak from the wood. I unpacked slowly, putting food in the fridge, stacking firewood by the stove, laying out my sleeping bag on the bed even though the bed had sheets. I wasn't sure when they'd last been washed. I come out here to be alone for a while, to get away from the noise and rush of everything back home. No phone service, no neighbors, no traffic. Just me and the woods. By the time I finished, the light outside had gone from golden to that pale, washed-out gray that comes right before dark. I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup on the stove, bread, and a glass of water, and ate it standing by the little window over the sink. From there, I could see the trees swaying gently. The wind had picked up a little, and every now and then a gust would carry leaves across the clearing in front of the cabin. It wasn't until I was cleaning up that I thought I saw something move between the trees. Just a flicker, a shift of shape in the corner of my eye. I froze with the plate still in my hand, staring out through the glass. The forest stood still again, calm and empty. I told myself it was probably just the wind playing tricks, branches bending and snapping back. I turned away, but that tiny, prickling feeling stayed with me. Night in the woods is different from night anywhere else. It's heavier. The darkness doesn't just fill the spaces between things, it swallows them whole. By the time I locked the door and turned off the lights, the windows had gone black. They reflected the inside of the cabin like mirrors, hiding whatever was out there. I sat on the couch for a while, listening to the wood stove pop and settle. Somewhere outside, an owl called. Then came the faint sound of something moving through the leaves. Slow, uneven. I leaned forward, trying to hear better. The sound stopped. I sat still for a long time, counting in my head, waiting for it to start again. Nothing. Eventually, I told myself it was just a raccoon or deer. Out here, animals wandered close all the time. Still, when I went to the bedroom, I made sure the curtains were closed tight. It was sometime deep in the night when I woke up. No dreams, no reason, just awake. The cabin was silent except for the faint ticking of the metal stove cooling down. I stared into the dark, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not fast, not running, just slow and deliberate, moving on the dirt and leaves outside. The sound circled from the back of the cabin toward the front. I held my breath, counting the steps. They stopped. My first thought was that it could be an animal again, but there was a difference between the quick, light shuffle of a deer and the heavy, paced sound of a person walking. These were heavier, human. I stayed perfectly still, listening so hard my ears began to ring. After a long pause, the footsteps started again, moving along the side of the cabin. Then silence. I got up quietly, moving to the window, careful not to let the floorboards creak. I lifted the curtain just a fraction of an inch. Blackness, the reflection of my own eye in the glass. I couldn't see anything past it. I stood there for maybe a full minute, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but it was useless. Whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't moving now. I let the curtain drop and backed away from the window, my pulse thudding hard in my ears. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak and groan of the cabin kept me on edge, every shift in the wind making me think of those steps. When morning came, I checked outside. The ground was damp from a light rain, and in the dirt near the side of the cabin, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't boots like mine. These were bare feet. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The idea was simple. 3 days alone in a small cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. No neighbors, no phone reception, no work emails. Just me, a stack of food supplies, a few changes of clothes, and a lot of quiet. I had rented the cabin from a man who met me at a gas station 30 miles away and handed me a key, telling me to follow a dirt road until it ended. The drive-in was slow. The dirt track was narrow and uneven, twisting between tall pines. Branches scraped the sides of my car, and small rocks pinged against the undercarriage. I passed no other cars, no signs of life. When the road ended, it ended hard, just a dead stop in front of a wooden gate. Beyond it was the cabin, a squat, single-story structure with weather-worn walls and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The wood was gray and rough, the windows dusty. I hauled my things inside in 2 trips. The air inside was cold and had that heavy, stale smell of a place closed up for too long. The living room was small, with a couch that looked like it had been sat on by 100 tired people, and a low coffee table with scratches in the surface. The kitchen was just a corner of the same space. Small sink, 2-burner stove, a little counter. In the back was a single bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame. The bathroom was barely big enough to turn around in. Everything felt simple and functional, but old. The first day was calm. I unpacked, put away my food, and took a slow walk around the cabin. There was a clearing of maybe 30 feet before the trees closed in again. Past that, the forest seemed endless. The pines were tall and close together, the ground littered with dry needles that muffled my steps. It was quiet, so quiet that my own breathing sounded louder than usual. That night, I cooked pasta on the little stove and ate at the table. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees outside. I read for a while, then went to bed early. The second day started just as quietly. I made coffee, then decided to hike deeper into the woods. I followed a faint animal trail for over an hour, but the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees were dense, the light dim even though it was midday. At one point I thought I heard something behind me. A soft, quick sound, like a footstep, but when I stopped, everything was still. I kept walking but cut the hike shorter than planned and headed back to the cabin. That night, I was sitting on the couch when I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, maybe branches moving. Then it came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I held still, listening. A few seconds passed. Another crunch. It wasn't the wind. It was too heavy for that. I moved to the window, but the glass was dusty, and the porch light didn't reach far into the clearing. I couldn't see anything moving. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe. I went to bed, but the sound stayed in my head. On the third morning, I found something odd. About 20 feet from the cabin, just inside the tree line, there were marks in the dirt, fresh footprints. Not boots or shoes, bare feet. The prints were small, maybe the size of my own, but the toes were spread wide and pressed deep into the soil. They came from deeper in the woods, stopped just at the edge of the clearing, then turned back. I spent the day inside after that, keeping busy with reading and making notes in a small journal. Every so often I looked out the window, scanning the tree line. The unease from the hike had turned into something sharper. That night, I locked the door earlier than usual. I double-checked it, then checked the windows. The sound came again around midnight. This time it was closer, slower. I stayed in bed, eyes open, listening as the steps came to the porch. The wood creaked under the weight. The sound paused. Then there was the faintest brushing sound, like fingertips dragging along the siding. My breathing was loud in my own ears. After what felt like a long time, the sounds faded away. In the morning, I saw nothing unusual. No footprints on the porch. No sign anyone had been there. But I didn't believe it was my imagination. The final night was worse. It started with the same slow steps outside. Then the sound of something moving around the cabin, circling it. Every so often, a short pause, then more steps. At one point, the back window rattled, just slightly, like someone had touched it. I sat in the dark, muscles tight, gripping a heavy flashlight in my lap. The noises stopped sometime before dawn. When light finally came, I went outside, heart still pounding. That's when I saw the footprints again, circling the entire cabin this time. Always close, never more than a few feet from the walls. I packed my things in under 5 minutes. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into my bag. I didn't eat, didn't clean up, just shoved everything into the car. The drive out was fast and rough, branches scraping the car as I tore down the dirt road. I didn't look in the mirror until I reached the highway. Even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl. Whoever it was never tried to break in. They never spoke. They just walked, slow and steady, night after night, watching the cabin. And I still don't know how long they had been doing it before I heard them for the first time. It was late September when I decided to take a short break from everything and spend a few days alone in a cabin that I had rented deep in the woods. I had found the place through a small online listing, the kind of ad you only notice if you're specifically searching for something remote. The photos showed a small wooden structure surrounded by tall trees, with a narrow dirt path leading to it and a lake just a short walk away. I didn't choose it for luxury. I chose it for silence. I had been feeling crowded lately, crowded by people, noise, and the constant hum of life in the city. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind in the trees and maybe the sound of water moving against a shore. The drive took hours. The last stretch was along a gravel road that seemed to go on forever, winding between walls of dark pines. I remember the air changing as I got deeper in, cooler, cleaner, and carrying that faint scent of damp leaves. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low enough that the forest looked darker than it should for late afternoon. I parked next to the cabin and stepped out. It was completely still. No hum of distant cars, no voices, not even the sound of birds at that moment. The silence was heavy, and it felt like the trees around me were leaning in just slightly, as if they were curious about me. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but in decent shape. The wood was weathered but solid. The single front window had thick glass, and the door was heavy. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and dust. There was a single bed pushed against one wall, a small wood stove in the corner, a narrow table with 2 chairs, and a small counter with a portable gas burner for cooking. No electricity, no running water, exactly what I was looking for. There was a lantern and some candles on the table, a few blankets folded neatly on the bed, and a shelf with some canned food and matches. I dropped my bag on the bed, opened the one window, and let the cool air drift inside. The first evening passed quietly. I cooked some pasta on the burner, ate while sitting at the table, and watched the forest darken through the window. The cabin grew colder as the sun went down, so I started a fire in the stove. The crackling sound was comforting. I stayed up for a while, reading a book I'd brought, but my eyes grew heavy quickly. When I stepped outside before bed, the night air was sharp. The moon was barely visible between the trees, and everything was covered in shadow. The quiet was almost too much, so deep that even my own breathing felt loud. That first night, I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside. It was faint, maybe just leaves shifting in the wind, but it sounded heavier than that, like something stepping on branches. I stayed still in bed, listening. After a while, it stopped. I told myself it was just an animal passing through. Out here, that was normal. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning was bright and cold. A thin mist hung low over the forest floor. I made coffee on the burner and took it outside to drink while standing on the small porch. The air was crisp, and for a while, everything felt exactly as I had hoped. Quiet, calm, far away from anything that could demand my attention. I decided to explore the area. I followed a faint trail behind the cabin that wound through the trees. It wasn't an official trail, just a worn path from years of footsteps, likely from hunters or whoever had stayed in the cabin before me. I walked for maybe an hour, moving slowly, noticing the way the light shifted as the sun climbed higher. I didn't see any other structures, no other cabins, not even a fire pit or signs of recent camping. I felt completely alone out there. By the second night, I had settled into the rhythm of the place. I cooked a simple meal, read by lantern light, and listened to the forest. But again, at some point after midnight, I woke up to sounds outside. This time it was clearer, slow, deliberate steps, not the random rustle of an animal. My body tensed. I stayed perfectly still, ears straining. The steps circled the cabin. They were slow, unhurried, almost measured. At one point they stopped, and the silence after that was worse than the sound itself. I imagined someone or something standing just outside the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel the presence. After what felt like a long time, the steps started again and faded into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked outside. The ground around the cabin was covered in dry leaves and pine needles, but I thought I saw faint impressions in the dirt. Shapes that could have been from boots, though I wasn't sure. They were shallow and uneven, and I couldn't follow them far before they vanished into the forest floor. The third day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped some wood from the small pile behind it, keeping myself busy. The forest was calm, but every now and then, I caught myself glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see movement. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Out here, the smallest sounds felt bigger. That night, it happened again. The same steps, slow and deliberate, circling. I sat up in bed this time, listening carefully. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. There was a moment when the steps came right up to the wall near my bed and stopped. I could hear breathing faint, but there, my mouth went dry. I stayed frozen, not wanting to make a sound. Minutes passed. Then the steps moved away again. This time, instead of fading completely, they paused by the front door. I heard the faint sound of the handle shifting. It didn't turn fully, just a tiny metallic sound, like someone testing it. Then, nothing. When morning came, I checked the door. The handle felt cold, maybe colder than it should have been, but I couldn't see any clear sign that it had been touched. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for prints, but again, I only found faint shapes that could have been anything. By now, I was on edge. The feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I told myself I'd leave the next day, even though I'd planned to stay longer. I spent most of that day inside, keeping the lantern close even during daylight. That final night was the worst. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly, but it didn't. Every creak of the wood, every small sound outside, made me tense. Sometime after midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they didn't circle. They came straight toward the door. The handle turned fully, rattling against the latch. I held my breath, heart hammering. Then came a slow, deliberate push against the door. The wood groaned slightly, but it held. After a few seconds, the pressure stopped. I heard nothing for a while, and I thought maybe whoever or whatever it was had gone. Then, the sound of fingernails or something sharp dragging slowly along the wall reached my ears, starting near the door and moving toward the window by my bed. The sound was slow, like someone taking their time. I stayed completely still, gripping the edge of the blanket so hard my fingers ached. The dragging sound stopped under the window. I could feel the weight of someone standing there, just on the other side of the glass. My mind kept flashing images of a face staring in, but I didn't move to check. After what felt like hours, there was silence. At some point, exhaustion must have pulled me under, because I woke to the pale light of morning. I didn't waste time. I packed my bag quickly, loaded it into the car, and drove out without looking back at the cabin. Even now, I don't know if it was a person or something else entirely human but uninvited. All I know is that it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. The steps had purpose, and whoever they belonged to had been testing, watching, waiting. The forest had been quiet, but it wasn't empty. I had not been to the cabin in almost 3 years. It was not mine, but it belonged to a man I knew through work who let me use it whenever I wanted, as long as I took care of it. It sat far out in the woods, about a 40-minute drive down a dirt road after leaving the main highway, with no other houses or cabins within several miles. The last time I had been there, it had been during summer, but now it was the middle of autumn, and the air was already sharp with cold. The trees were mostly bare, their branches gray and twisted, the ground covered in a thick layer of damp leaves that stuck to my boots when I got out of the truck. The cabin itself was small and simple. One story, with siding weathered gray, with a tin roof that always seemed to make too much noise when the wind moved across it. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and the steps creaked no matter how lightly you tried to walk on them. It had one main room with a small kitchen in the corner, a short hallway that led to a single bedroom, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. There was a wood stove against the far wall, a couple of old chairs, and a table that wobbled if you leaned on it. The place always smelled faintly of pine and dust, even after you cleaned. I had brought enough supplies for 3 nights. Cans of food, some bread, coffee, a couple of jugs of water, and enough firewood to get through the weekend if I kept the stove going. I had no real reason for coming other than wanting to be alone for a while. Life back in town had been noisy, too many people, too many things demanding attention. I figured the quiet would help me clear my head. The first day went by without anything unusual. I unpacked, swept out the cabin, and checked the small shed out back to make sure no animals had gotten in. The shed door stuck halfway open, but when I forced it, I saw everything was the same. Some tools, a rusted axe, and a stack of rotting boards. The sun went down early, the light fading into a dim blue glow through the windows before disappearing entirely. I made a fire in the stove, sat in one of the chairs, and read until I felt tired enough to sleep. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. The cabin was silent except for the faint ticking of the stove cooling down. The air felt colder than I expected, and I could smell the sharp bite of wood smoke. I lay still for a while, thinking maybe the wind had woken me. But then I heard something outside. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone stepping on damp leaves. Not an animal scurrying, not the light patter of a raccoon or fox, but something heavier. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, then again. It moved past the side of the cabin, toward the back. My heartbeat had started to speed up, and I tried to tell myself it could be a deer. There were plenty in the area. But something about the way the steps paused now and then continued didn't feel right. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, until the sound faded. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, though it was restless. The next morning, I went outside to look. The ground behind the cabin was damp from a light rain that must have fallen overnight, and in the mud near the corner, I saw clear footprints. They were boot prints, not animal tracks. The size looked average, but the pattern was sharp enough that they couldn't be more than several hours old. They led from the tree line toward the back of the cabin, stopped near the wall, and then turned and went back the same way. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My first thought was maybe it was a hunter passing through, but it bothered me that whoever it was had come so close to the cabin without making themselves known. I checked the shed again, still locked. I looked around the property but didn't see anything else unusual. After a while, I went back inside, trying to push it out of my mind. The second night was colder. I kept the fire going later, making sure the cabin was warm before I went to bed. Around midnight, I woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was the faint sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. Came once, then again like a soft scrape of wood against wood. Then I heard it 3 distinct knocks on the back wall. Slow, even. I sat up in bed, every muscle tense. I could feel the air in the room was colder now, as if the warmth had been sucked out. My breathing sounded too loud in the silence. I waited, but there was nothing else. No more knocking, no footsteps, just stillness. In the morning, I went to the back wall. There were fresh marks in the wood, scratches thin and shallow, but definitely new. They ran in short, uneven lines, some overlapping. I couldn't tell what had made them. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. I decided to stay, but I kept my jacket and boots near the bed, just in case. That afternoon, I didn't go far from the cabin. I stayed close, splitting some of the firewood I had brought, walking the property line. At one point, I saw movement between the trees, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably my own nerves making me see things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the third night, I was on edge. I set a chair against the door and kept the axe from the shed inside, leaning it near the stove. I didn't sleep much. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they came from the front of the cabin, slow and steady, crunching in the leaves. They stopped just outside. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then the doorknob rattled. Not hard, not like someone trying to break in, but a slow turn and release like testing it. I stayed frozen in the chair by the stove, holding the axe, until the sound stopped. Then I heard the footsteps moving away, fading into the woods. The first light, I stepped outside. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt in front of the porch. They came straight from the trees up to the door and then back the same way. I followed them for about 20 yards until they reached the denser woods, then lost them in the leaves. By then, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed everything quickly, loaded it into the truck, and locked the cabin. On the drive back down the dirt road, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following. I didn't, but I never forgot the feeling of those nights. The slow, deliberate footsteps, the marks on the wall, the doorknob turning. Whoever it was, they never said a word, never made their reason known. And that was the worst part. Knowing that someone had been out there in the dark, close enough to touch the cabin walls, close enough to test the door, and that I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. It had been about 3 hours since I'd last seen another car on the narrow road leading deeper into the forest. The highway had long since turned into a 2-lane strip of cracked asphalt, then into a gravel path, and finally into a hard-packed dirt road with grass and weeds growing in the center. I kept glancing at the fuel gauge, though I knew I'd topped up in the last small town, and my phone had been without service since the moment I left that place behind. I wasn't worried at first. I planned this trip for weeks. I'd rented a small cabin that supposedly sat on a quiet lake miles away from anyone else. That isolation was exactly what I'd wanted. Just a few days away from work, noise, and people. The sky was the kind of pale gray that made it hard to tell what time it was. The air was heavy, like rain had already fallen somewhere nearby. I could smell damp earth through the vents. The road twisted between tall pines and old hardwoods, some leaning over the track like they'd been growing toward each other for years. The GPS had gone silent miles ago, the little blue dot frozen in place, so I was relying on printed directions I'd pulled from the rental website. I finally reached the point where the road ended in a small clearing. The cabin sat on the far side, low and wide, its brown wood siding dark from years of weather. The place didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look welcoming either. The yard was mostly wild grass, wet from earlier rain, and the lake stretched out behind the cabin, flat and gray, with thin mist hovering above it. The air was cooler when I stepped out of the car. The forest around the clearing was silent except for the faint hiss of wind in the trees. No birds, no insects, just the sound of water lapping faintly against the shore somewhere behind the cabin. My boots sank slightly into the damp ground as I carried my bag up the short path to the porch. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The main room was small but clean. A couch sat against one wall, a low table in front of it, and a small kitchenette on the other side with an old electric stove and a compact fridge. A single hallway led toward the back, where I found the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was simple: wood-paneled walls, plain curtains, a bed with a heavy quilt, and a single lamp beside it. The windows looked out toward the lake. By the time I'd unpacked my bag and checked the fridge, the sky was already darker. It was only late afternoon, but the clouds had thickened. I decided to walk down to the lake before it got too dim. The path was just a few steps from the back door, narrow and muddy in spots. The water was flat and still, broken only by the occasional ripple near the far shore. The mist made the opposite bank look farther away than it probably was. I could see the outlines of trees but nothing else. No docks, no cabins, no boats. It was exactly the kind of quiet I'd wanted, though something about the stillness felt heavier than I'd expected. I stood there for a while, watching the faint movement of the water, then headed back inside. The cabin's walls creaked faintly as they cooled in the evening air. I made a simple dinner on the stove and ate at the small table. The sound of my fork against the plate was loud in the otherwise silent room. Afterward, I stepped outside again. The clearing was already dim, the trees black shapes against the fading light. The smell of damp leaves and earth was stronger now. Back inside, I turned on the single lamp in the living area and sat on the couch. I'd brought a book, but I kept finding myself glancing at the windows. The glass reflected the room more than it showed the outside now, but I could still see the vague outline of the yard beyond. I reminded myself I was just unused to being this far from people. That night, I lay in bed listening to the faint lap of water against the shore. The wind had died completely, and the cabin seemed unnaturally still. Every small sound, the ticking of the cooling stove, the creak of the floorboards, stood out in the quiet. I eventually drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke without knowing why. The air in the room felt colder, though the small electric heater near the wall still hummed faintly. I lay still for a moment, listening. The sound that reached me was faint, something moving outside, slow and irregular. It wasn't the rustle of wind in branches. It was heavier, closer to the ground. I told myself it was probably an animal. I turned onto my side, but the sound continued. Faint steps through the damp grass, then a pause, then more steps. They were close enough that I imagined they were in the clearing. I stayed still, staring at the dark outline of the curtains. After what felt like minutes, the sound stopped. The quiet after it felt heavier than before. I don't remember falling back asleep, but when I opened my eyes again, pale light was filtering in through the curtains. The morning was cool and damp. I made coffee and stepped outside with the mug in my hand. The clearing looked the same as before, but the grass near the path to the lake was bent in several places, like something had passed through during the night. The tracks weren't clear enough to identify. They could have been from a deer, though they didn't seem quite right. I decided not to think about it. I spent the day walking around the lake. The ground was soft under the trees, covered in damp leaves. The air smelled faintly of pine and wet soil. I found no signs of other people, no paths, no trash, no boats. Just more trees and water. By the time I got back, clouds were gathering again. That night, I made sure the back door was locked and the curtains were drawn tight. The lamp cast a warm glow inside, but I kept glancing toward the windows again. The stillness outside seemed to press against the glass. When I finally went to bed, I left the small lamp in the living room on. Sometime later, I woke again to that same sound. Slow steps outside, pausing between each one. This time they were closer to the cabin itself. I could hear the faint rustle of grass and the creak of a porch board. My chest felt tight as I lay still. The steps moved along the porch, then stopped. I didn't move. I just listened, straining to hear any other noise. After what felt like a long time, the sound moved away, slow at first, then fading entirely. Morning came with a low fog over the clearing. My boots were wet with dew when I stepped outside. There were faint depressions in the soft dirt near the porch, too wide and uneven to be deer tracks. I told myself it could have been a wandering dog from some far-off place. But that day, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the tree line across the clearing, several branches were broken higher up, like something had pushed through forcefully. I couldn't see far into the trees. The mist hung between the trunks, muting the distance. I'll continue this exactly as you want, long, ultra-detailed, in one uninterrupted piece. But before I dump the next 6,000 plus words in one go, I need to know if you want all of it here in a single giant message, which will be extremely long and might be hard to scroll, or if you'd prefer me to post it in one single uninterrupted block but split into a couple of back-to-back messages so nothing gets cut off. Which do you prefer? The drive up to the cabin had been longer than I expected. The narrow road wound through dense forest that looked darker than it should for the middle of the afternoon. My phone had lost signal about an hour earlier, and the last gas station I had passed felt like it belonged in another time. The cabin was supposed to be simple and quiet, a place to stay for 3 nights so I could get away from the noise and pace of the city. I had booked it because it was cheap, isolated, and had no other cabins nearby. That isolation had seemed like a bonus when I made the booking, but as I drove further into the trees, I noticed how empty it really was out here. No other cars, no hikers, no cabins tucked between the trees, just a single-lane road and endless forest on both sides. When I finally pulled up to the clearing, the cabin stood in the center of it like it had been abandoned for years, even though the listing had said it was kept in rustic but functional condition. The wood was darkened with age, the windows looked cloudy, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. The air outside was colder than I expected. Not freezing, but enough that my breath faintly showed when I exhaled. The sound of my car shutting off was swallowed by the quiet. No wind, no birds, just stillness. I unloaded my bags slowly, looking around the clearing. The tree line was about 20 meters away in every direction, and the trees themselves were tall and thick with branches starting far above my head. The forest floor was a carpet of dead leaves and moss, broken up by exposed roots. The clearing looked as though it had been roughly cut into the forest decades ago and never properly maintained. The grass was long and yellowed, with patches of bare dirt near the cabin steps. The front steps creaked under my weight. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. A damp, closed-in scent mixed with something faintly metallic. Inside was dim, the light from the door barely reaching the far corners of the main room. The floorboards were uneven, the walls unpainted, and the furniture mismatched. A small wood stove sat in one corner, its black metal dull with rust spots. There was no electricity, just a couple of oil lamps and a box of matches sitting on the table. I checked each room, not because I expected anything to be inside, but because the place felt like it needed to be checked. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress and a pile of folded blankets. The bathroom was small, with a metal bucket for water and no mirror. The kitchen area was nothing more than a counter, an old hand pump for water, and some shelves with canned goods. Everything felt still, like no one had been here in months. By the time I unpacked and lit one of the lamps, the daylight outside had started to fade. It wasn't late enough to be dark, but the heavy tree cover made it feel later. I stepped outside again to take in the air. The forest looked exactly the same as it had earlier, but there was something about it now, a weight in the air, as if the space between the trees was thicker, harder to look into. I heard it for the first time while standing there. A short, sharp crack from deep in the woods. At first I thought it was just a branch breaking naturally, maybe from the cold, but it was followed by a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. I stood still, watching the tree line, but saw nothing move. After a minute, the sound stopped. Back inside, I tried to shake it off. I unpacked some food, lit the stove, and boiled water. The heat from the stove made the air more comfortable, but the smell of the cabin was still there, that faint metallic note I couldn't place. I sat at the table, eating quietly. That was when the second sound came, this time from closer. A series of footsteps in the clearing, slow and deliberate, crushing the long grass and twigs. They moved from one side of the cabin to the other, stopping every few seconds like whoever or whatever it was kept pausing to listen. I sat frozen, holding my breath. The footsteps moved toward the back of the cabin. I thought about looking out the window but decided against it. The glass was too dirty to see clearly anyway, and I didn't want to give away my position with movement. The sound stopped at the far side of the cabin and didn't return. For the rest of that night, I heard small noises outside. Twigs snapping, something brushing against the wall. A dull thud, as though something had been dropped. Every time I started to relax, another noise would start. I didn't sleep much, lying on the bed under the thin blankets, staring at the dark ceiling. When morning came, the air inside felt stale and cold. I stepped outside to check the clearing. The grass was bent down in places, as if someone had walked slowly across it during the night. Near the back of the cabin, the dirt showed clear impressions. Not boots, but bare feet. They were larger than mine and spaced far apart, like the person had been taking long, careful steps. The prints led to the tree line and disappeared into the shadows. I told myself it was probably some local person, maybe passing through, but that didn't make much sense. There was nothing out here, and the footprints were fresh. No frost, no debris in them, no signs of age. Whoever made them had been here not long before dawn. The second day was worse. The air stayed overcast, and the light never seemed to brighten fully. I kept feeling watched even inside. Every time I stepped out, I found myself glancing toward the trees. In the afternoon, while collecting wood near the edge of the clearing, I thought I saw movement, a pale shape slipping behind one of the larger trees. I stood there for a full minute, staring, but saw nothing else. That night, the noises came back, louder this time. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, stopping at random points. Once, something brushed against the window hard enough to rattle the glass. At one point, there was a scraping sound along the front door, like metal dragging over wood. I stayed inside, holding the small hatchet I'd found in the kitchen, my heart hammering. It went on for hours. The noises would stop, and I'd think it was over, but then they'd start again. I couldn't tell how many people there were. Sometimes it sounded like one set of steps, other times 2 or 3. No talking, no lights, just the sounds and the knowledge that they were close. By the 3rd morning, I had decided to leave early. I packed my bags quickly and loaded them into the car. The clearing felt too quiet again, but the forest beyond seemed heavier than before, like the air itself was pressing inward. I drove down the narrow road, checking the mirrors more often than I needed to. About a mile from the cabin, I saw them. Off to the right, standing just inside the trees, half hidden by the branches, 3 figures, all barefoot, all standing perfectly still. Their faces were pale, their clothes torn or missing in places, their eyes following the car as I passed. None of them moved. None of them made a sound. I kept driving, forcing myself not to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station miles down the road. When I stepped out, my legs felt weak. The attendant gave me a strange look, probably because I kept scanning the trees across the road. Even in the daylight, I felt it, that same pressure, that same watching. I never went back for the 3rd night. I didn't even leave a note for the owner. And I never told anyone exactly what I saw, because I didn't want to hear them try to explain it away. I know what was there. I know they were waiting, and I know they weren't just passing through. I had driven for almost 5 hours before the road turned to gravel and narrowed so much that my truck barely fit between the trees. The air was colder here, the kind that bit into the skin even in daylight. I kept going, my tires crunching over loose stone, until the tree line opened just enough to reveal the cabin. It sat alone on a small clearing, dark wood walls and a sloped tin roof streaked with rust. There was no other building in sight, no sound of passing cars, not even the distant hum of power lines. It looked the same as in the listing photos, but in person it felt much farther away from anything. I parked beside it, stepping out into the silence. Even my own breathing sounded too loud. The wind barely moved through the pine needles, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The floorboards were cold under my boots, and the air smelled stale, as if the place had been shut up for a long time. I set my bag on the couch, glanced around, and tried to convince myself this was exactly what I wanted. A quiet weekend, no interruptions, no schedule. The cabin had one main room with a small wood stove in the corner, a narrow kitchen along the wall, and a single bedroom off to the side. A single window faced the clearing where I'd parked, and another looked out into the woods. There was no phone service, and the Wi-Fi the owner had mentioned in the ad was clearly a fantasy. I was completely cut off. That was supposed to be the appeal. I spent the afternoon stacking the small pile of firewood inside, unpacking food, and taking short walks around the clearing. The forest here felt heavy, the trees close together, their trunks dark and damp with moss. Even in daylight, there was something in the way they stood, tall, silent, pressing in. Every few minutes, I would glance back at the cabin just to make sure it was still there, almost expecting it to vanish behind the trees. By sunset, the clearing was swallowed in shadow. I lit a fire in the stove and ate in the dim orange light. Outside, the darkness came fast, turning the woods into a solid wall. The window glass reflected the interior like a mirror, hiding whatever might be beyond it. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept in as I moved around inside, the sense that something in the forest was awake now. When I stepped outside before bed to check the lock on my truck, the cold hit me harder. My breath came out in clouds, and the stillness was absolute. I heard no owls, no crickets, no movement at all. I turned quickly back inside, bolted the door, and shut off the lights. The mattress was thin, the blankets smelled faintly of dust, but I eventually drifted off to sleep with the faint crackle of the stove in my ears. Sometime later, I woke without knowing why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was barely lit by the faint glow. The air was cold now. I lay still, listening. There was no sound from the woods, but I felt something, an awareness, as if I had been watched for longer than I realized. I turned my head toward the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement just beyond the glass, a shape darker than the darkness itself. It was gone almost instantly. I told myself it could have been anything. Shadows, my own reflection, a branch shifting. But the more I stared at the window, the more certain I became that I had not imagined it. My heartbeat thudded hard in my ears. I stayed still until the cold drove me to add more wood to the stove, then lay back down, eyes on the faint line of the window until sleep took me again. Morning brought a weak gray light. The woods looked the same as before, but when I stepped outside, my boots stopped dead in the frost. About 20 feet from the window, in the patch of dirt between the pine needles, was a single footprint. The ground was frozen, but the print was clear, pressed deep, with edges that looked fresh. It was larger than mine and faced directly toward the cabin. I crouched there for a long moment, staring at it, before slowly looking around the clearing. There were no other prints I could see, just that one. Whoever had made it had either stepped carefully or had been here watching for longer than I realized. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to keep moving, checking the tree line, the truck, the far side of the cabin. Nothing else. The rest of the day, I tried to distract myself with small tasks. Splitting wood, boiling water, walking short loops through the trees with my eyes scanning every shadow. By late afternoon, the sky was already dimming, the temperature dropping fast. I built the fire higher than before and sat close to it, not liking how quickly the windows became mirrors again in the night. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, I knew what had pulled me out of sleep. A faint crunch of snow or frost outside. Slow, deliberate. My eyes locked on the window, but it was black glass now. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another crunch, then nothing. The silence was worse than the sound had been. I stayed awake until my body ached from the tension. The faint warmth of the stove, the only thing keeping me from shaking. By morning, I found more prints. This time 2 of them closer to the window. Same size as before. They weren't mine. I didn't go far from the cabin that day. My eyes kept flicking toward the woods, every shadow and bent branch turning into a figure. I counted the daylight hours, waiting for them to run out. That night, the sound came earlier, around 10. Not just a crunch this time, but the faint drag of something over the frozen ground. I sat upright in bed, staring at the black window, every muscle tense. Then a softer sound, like a breath against the glass. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. When the fire died again near dawn, I stepped outside, my stomach heavy with dread. The prints were all around the cabin now, circling it, some close enough that whoever it was could have reached out and touched the walls. My truck's windshield had a faint smear across it, as if a hand had been dragged across the frost. I knew then that this wasn't just someone passing through the woods. This was deliberate. Whoever it was had been out there both nights, standing close, watching. I packed my bag fast, my hands shaking as I shoved everything inside. The road was narrow and icy, but I didn't care. I started the truck, the engine sounding too loud in the stillness, and drove without looking back. Hours later, when I reached the first small town with phone service, I pulled into a gas station and sat there, staring out the windshield. My hands were still cold, my body still tight with the knowledge that while I had been inside that cabin, alone, someone had been walking slow circles around it in the dark. Not rushing, not hiding, just watching. And if I hadn't left when I did, I couldn't stop thinking about what the next night might have been. I arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, the sun hanging low but still bright enough to keep the air warm. The road had been a narrow strip of gravel that wound through thick pine forest for almost an hour. The trees stood so close together in some places that they formed tunnels of shade, blocking out the light entirely. My tires had thrown up small stones along the way, and every time one clattered off the undercarriage, it reminded me how far I was from anyone who could help if something went wrong. The cabin was small, built of weathered logs, the kind where the corners still held the marks of the axe. It sat on a shallow rise above a lake, with a narrow wooden dock jutting into the water. From where I stood, the lake surface looked like glass, reflecting the pale blue of the sky and the darker blue of the surrounding trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, with a faint touch of smoke from a fire someone must have had days ago. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The air was stale, a mix of dust and old wood, like it had been closed up too long. The floorboards creaked under my boots. There was one main room with a small wood stove, a table, and a few shelves along the wall. A narrow doorway led to a bedroom with a single bed. The mattress sagged in the middle. I dropped my backpack on the table, the sound echoing more than it should have in the quiet. After checking the windows and making sure they latched, I stepped back outside. The wind had picked up slightly, moving through the treetops with a whispering sound. I walked down to the dock, the boards flexing a little under my weight. From here, I could see deeper into the lake. Shadows shifting under the surface, maybe fish or maybe just weeds moving with the water. I stood there for a while, listening to the soft lapping of water against the wood, until I realized I could no longer hear the usual sounds of birds or insects. That silence stayed with me as I returned to the cabin. I unpacked a few things, set up my sleeping bag on top of the mattress, and made a small meal from what I had brought. As evening crept in, the shadows grew sharper and longer, and the air cooled fast. I lit a small fire in the stove. The pop and crackle of burning would fill the cabin, but beyond the walls, it was too quiet. I kept glancing toward the windows, expecting to see movement, but there was only the stillness of the trees. Later that night, I heard something, a soft, deliberate sound from outside, like a footstep on the gravel, slow and careful. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Another step, and then nothing. I waited, my ears straining, the fire in the stove hissing softly as sap in the logs boiled and popped. The noise didn't come again, but the feeling stayed. A prickle along my neck, a tightening in my stomach. When I finally lay down, I kept my head turned toward the window, watching the faint outline of the trees against the dim sky. The sound came again, closer this time, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I stayed still, gripping the edge of my sleeping bag, my eyes fixed on the darkness outside. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then it stopped. Minutes passed. My eyelids grew heavy, but each time they closed, some small noise, like a twig snapping, would bring me back to full alertness. In the morning, I checked outside. The ground was covered in a thin layer of pine needles, making it hard to see prints. But near the back of the cabin, I noticed a few disturbances. Small patches of bare soil, as if someone or something had stepped there. The indentations were too irregular to be clear footprints, but they weren't natural. I told myself it could have been an animal. That was easier to believe. The day was uneventful, but I found myself glancing toward the tree line more often. At one point, while down by the dock, I thought I saw something move between the trees. Something dark, there and gone in a blink. My chest tightened. I stared at that spot for a long time, but nothing else moved. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. The noises returned. Slow, careful steps circling the cabin, pausing, then moving again. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, I saw the same disturbed patches in the soil, more of them now circling wider. The third night was worse. The sounds began earlier, before I had even fully settled in. I kept the fire low to avoid casting too much light out the windows. The steps came closer, then stopped. I sat there, every muscle tense, until something brushed against the window itself. A slow scrape, like fingers or claws, dragged across the glass. My throat went dry. I didn't move. The scraping stopped, and after a long time, the steps retreated. When morning came, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, my hands trembling slightly. As I stepped outside, I saw them, clear footprints now, in the softer ground near the dock. Human, barefoot. The prints led toward the trees and vanished in the shadows. I didn't look back as I drove away. The forest closed around me on the road, the trees swallowing the light. Every so often I checked the mirror, half expecting to see someone there, walking barefoot down the gravel, watching me leave. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the kind of light where the sun is still up but already dipping low, making the shadows stretch across the ground like long fingers. The air felt cooler than I expected, crisp and dry, carrying the smell of pine and damp soil. My truck's tires crunched over the gravel driveway until I rolled to a stop in front of the small wooden structure. It wasn't much, just a single-story box with a pitched roof, dark brown boards weathered from years of wind and snow. The windows were small, their glass catching bits of fading sunlight. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt heavy, like the world had been turned down a notch. The place was mine for 3 nights. I'd booked it because it was far from everything. No neighbors, no phone service, nothing but trees and the occasional dirt road miles away. I wanted the quiet. I thought it would help me clear my head. The air smelled so different from the city that for a moment I just stood there, breathing it in. Then I started hauling my bags inside. The cabin's interior was simple. A small kitchen area with a propane stove and a metal sink, a living space with a wood stove and a sagging couch, and a short hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. The wood floors were scuffed, and a thin rug covered part of the living room. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it was clean enough. I unpacked my food, stacking canned goods on the counter and stuffing perishables into the old refrigerator, which hummed unevenly. The quiet was absolute. So quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock and the soft creak of the boards when I moved. By the time I'd settled in, the light outside was dimming. I decided to get some wood chopped before it got fully dark. There was a small shed out back with a stack of logs and a splitting axe leaning against it. As I worked, the forest around me grew darker. The tall pines loomed overhead, their tops swaying slightly in the breeze. Every so often I'd pause and listen. I could hear birds still calling in the distance, but no other sounds. No cars, no voices, just the wind and the faint thud of the axe hitting wood. I brought the wood inside and started a small fire in the stove. The orange light flickered against the walls, making the place feel warmer. I made a simple dinner, ate it while staring at the flames, and then spent a while reading. It was so still that the smallest noises felt amplified, like the ticking of the clock or the occasional pop from the fire. When I finally went to bed, the mattress sagged slightly under me, but the heavy quilt kept me warm. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the trees. That sound carried me into sleep. I woke sometime after midnight. First, I didn't know why. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow from the stove in the other room. The wind had died down and everything was still. I lay there listening. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound from outside, like footsteps on gravel or dry leaves. It wasn't steady, more like a few steps, then silence. My chest tightened. I stayed still, straining to hear. After a moment, the sound came again, closer this time. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees. But the steps sounded deliberate, heavy enough that I didn't think it was a small animal. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and moved to the window. The glass was cold under my fingers as I pushed the curtain aside just enough to look out. The moonlight made the clearing visible, but I couldn't see anyone or anything moving. The driveway was empty. The trees stood like black walls all around. I stayed there for a while, watching, my breath slow and shallow. Nothing moved. Finally, I let the curtain fall back and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was probably an animal and eventually lay back down. But it took a long time before I drifted off. The next morning was bright and cold. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, my breath showing in the air. I walked around the cabin, looking at the ground. The dirt and pine needles showed faint impressions, marks that looked like boot prints, not paw prints. They came from the direction of the trees and stopped a few feet from the back corner of the cabin. There weren't many of them, and they were hard to make out in places, but they were there. My stomach tightened as I stared at them. Someone had been here. I spent most of the day inside, glancing out the windows now and then. The forest looked harmless in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing just out of sight. I kept the axe inside with me. Every small sound outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, made me pause and listen. That night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight. I sat by the fire longer than usual, listening to the wood crackle. When I finally turned in, I left the small oil lamp burning in the bedroom. It felt childish, but the light made me feel less alone. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I knew, I was waking again in the dark. This time the sound was different, a faint scraping, like something brushing against the wall outside. Then a soft thud. My skin prickled. I sat up, listening. The sound moved slowly along the wall toward the window. My heartbeat felt too loud. I stayed still, watching the faint outline of the curtains. A shadow passed across them. Just a flicker, but enough to make me grip the quilt tightly. The sound stopped. Silence filled the room again. I sat there, every muscle tense, waiting. Minutes passed. Then I heard the soft crunch of footsteps moving away into the trees. I waited even longer before getting up and checking the window. Again, nothing. Just the pale light of the moon on the clearing. When morning came, I went outside to look again. Along the wall under the window, the dirt was disturbed. There were more boot prints, fresher this time, and closer to the cabin. They led toward the trees and disappeared into the undergrowth. My hands felt cold even though the sun was on my face. The rest of the day I stayed alert, barely going outside except to bring in more wood. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see someone standing out there. I thought about leaving, but the nearest main road was miles away, and I didn't want to drive it at night. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I sat up in bed with the lamp on, listening. Hours passed, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. I woke to the sound of the front door handle moving. It was faint, but in the stillness it was clear, the slow turn of metal. I froze. The lock held, but then came a quiet rattle, like someone testing it. My mouth went dry. I got up, moving silently to the corner of the room, the axe in my hand. The sound stopped. Then I heard slow footsteps on the porch boards, each one groaning slightly under the weight. They moved toward the side of the cabin, then faded. I stood there for what felt like forever, barely breathing. When the first light of dawn came, I didn't waste time. I threw my things in my bag, loaded the truck, and left. As I drove down the gravel road, I glanced back once. The cabin looked the same as it had when I arrived, quiet, still harmless. But I knew I'd never come back. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was up fully. The forest fell away behind me, but the thought stayed. Someone had been there, not an animal, not the wind. A person had walked up to that cabin in the night, stood outside my window and tried the door, and they hadn't said a word. It was late in the afternoon when I first noticed the sky turning heavier. I had been at the cabin for 2 days, and until then the weather had stayed dry and calm. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, about 30 minutes from the nearest paved road, and surrounded on all sides by thick trees that swayed slowly when the wind picked up. The air had a stillness that made every sound from the forest stand out, and I had been enjoying the quiet, at least until the feeling of unease began to creep in. I had rented the cabin as a way to get away from everything for a while. My phone signal was weak here, only working if I walked down the long dirt path toward the road. Inside, the cabin was basic but solid. One main room with a small kitchen in the corner, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with old plumbing that made a groaning sound when water ran. The floor was wooden and creaked faintly with every step. There was a wood stove near the center of the main room that I had been using for heat at night. That second afternoon, I was stacking firewood against the side wall when I noticed how dim it was getting. Even though it was barely past 4, clouds had moved in from the west, dark and dense, muting the sunlight until the entire forest looked shadowed. I kept working, setting each piece of wood neatly in place, but I found myself glancing more often into the treeline. I didn't know why, but I felt like there was a change in the air, not just from the weather, but something harder to put into words. By the time I had finished stacking the wood, the wind was coming in sharper, carrying the smell of damp earth. I went inside and closed the door, making sure the latch was firm. The cabin was silent except for the faint ticking of the small wall clock and the occasional gust that rattled the loose gutter outside. I sat down in the old armchair near the stove and tried to read, but my attention kept breaking. Every now and then I thought I heard something faint outside, like a branch snapping, but when I stood and listened there was nothing but the wind. Around 6, the rain began, soft at first, then heavier. It struck the roof in uneven rhythms, some drops tapping fast while others slid in long streaks down the small front window. I boiled water on the stove and made a simple meal, but as I ate, I kept glancing toward that window. The forest beyond it had become a black mass now, without shapes or detail, and the only light came from the reflection of the lamp inside. I told myself it was just the isolation making me restless, that I wasn't used to being in such a remote place alone, but that explanation didn't completely settle the unease. When night fully set in, I went through my routine, locking the door, checking the windows, placing my flashlight and matches on the table near the bed. I had done the same the night before without thinking much of it, but this time my movements felt slower, more deliberate. The wind outside had grown stronger, and every so often I could hear what sounded like something brushing against the siding, a scraping or dragging noise that would stop and then come again in a different spot. I assumed it was just branches shifting in the wind, though I didn't remember any trees being close enough to touch the walls. I lay in bed with the lamp off, listening. The roof popped faintly in the cold. The stove gave a soft metal ticking sound as it cooled, and the rain shifted in its rhythm. I was nearly asleep when I heard it. Clear this time, not something I could pass off as wind or settling wood. It was a crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate, somewhere near the side of the cabin. I held my breath and strained to listen, but after a few seconds it stopped. I stayed still for a long time, heart beating faster than it should, waiting for it to start again. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the faint gray light of early morning. The rain had stopped, but the ground outside looked slick and dark through the window. I made coffee and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. Still, I decided to walk around the cabin to check for any fallen branches or damage. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of wet leaves. On the far side of the cabin, near the back corner, I saw something that stopped me. In the soft mud, clear as day, were footprints. They weren't animal tracks. I'd seen enough deer and raccoon prints to know the difference. These were from boots, the kind with thick tread, and they led from the trees right up to the wall of the cabin. I crouched down, following them with my eyes. They stopped just at the siding, then turned and went back into the trees. I stayed there for a while, staring into the forest where the tracks disappeared. The trees stood close together, their trunks slick with rain, the ground uneven with roots and undergrowth. Whoever it was could have been watching the cabin for some time before leaving. The rest of the day, I couldn't settle. Every sound from outside pulled my attention. The thought of someone walking right up to the cabin in the middle of the night stayed in my head like a stone I couldn't shake loose. I considered packing up and leaving, but the weather was supposed to clear, and part of me didn't want to overreact. Still, I kept the flashlight on me even during the day, and I made sure to bring in more firewood than I needed so I wouldn't have to step outside after dark. That night came faster than I expected. The sky turned black earlier than the day before, and with the clearing weather, the temperature dropped sharply. I built up the fire until the stove gave off a steady, heavy warmth. I moved the armchair so I could see both the stove and the front window, telling myself it was just more comfortable that way. The forest was silent, too silent. Even in cold weather there were usually faint rustlings, the distant call of something moving in the trees, but now there was nothing but stillness. Around 10, I heard the first sound, a faint, slow step on the wet leaves. Then another, closer. My stomach tightened. I didn't move, listening hard. The steps came to a stop, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then, from the far side of the cabin, I heard it again. That slow scraping sound along the siding, like before. This time it moved from one side of the wall toward the back. I stood up as quietly as I could, heart hammering, and picked up the heavy flashlight from the table. I didn't go outside. Instead, I walked softly to the back window and looked out, angling the light so it wouldn't reflect back at me. The beam caught the slick wetness of tree trunks, the uneven ground, but nothing else. Still, I couldn't shake the certainty that someone was out there, moving just out of sight. For the next hour, I stayed near the stove, light in hand, waiting. Every so often I thought I heard movement in the trees, but it was faint, always fading before I could be sure. Finally, sometime past midnight, the sounds stopped completely. I waited longer before forcing myself to lie down. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by every creak and pop of the cabin. The next morning, I found more prints. This time they were fresher, pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin twice before heading off in the same direction as before. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing my bag without care for order, and carried everything to the truck. The forest felt different now, heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing in. The entire drive out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement on the road behind me. When I finally reached the main highway, the feeling eased, but it didn't disappear. Even now, thinking back, the part that unsettles me most isn't the footprints or the sounds. It's knowing that whoever was out there never tried to come in. They didn't rush the door, didn't break a window. They just stayed in the dark, circling, waiting for something I still don't understand. I went to the cabin in late autumn, when the leaves had mostly fallen and the air had that cold bite in the mornings that made you see your breath. It was a small place my uncle had left to me years ago, tucked in a stretch of forest that didn't see much traffic once the summer season was over. The roof was tin and the siding was dark, weathered wood, the kind that seemed to blend into the trees. There was no cell signal there and no neighbors within easy walking distance. The road in was a narrow dirt track that wound through stands of pines and birch, with ruts that could swallow the tires if you didn't take them slow. I liked that it was isolated. I told myself I was going to spend a week there to clear my head, maybe split some wood, read a little, and sleep without the noise of the city. The first couple of days were quiet in the way you expect in the woods. I'd wake up with the light coming in through the small window by the bed, make coffee on the propane stove, and step out onto the porch to see the fog lifting from the low ground. Sometimes a deer would be down near the tree-line, and I'd hear them move away when they caught my scent. I spent hours stacking what I'd split in the spring, checking the little rain barrel for ice, and patching a spot on the gutter where pine needles always clogged it up. Nights were cold but not yet freezing, and the old wood stove kept the place warm once it got going. I kept a small kerosene lantern lit on the table in the evenings, more out of habit than necessity, and went to bed early because the darkness outside felt complete and heavy. On the third night, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. It was a faint metallic rattle, like something brushing against the chain on the propane tank outside. I lay still, listening, the way you do when you're not sure if your mind's filling in the silence. It stopped after a few seconds, and I told myself it could have been a raccoon or a stray branch falling. But I stayed awake for a while after, hearing the small creaks of the cabin as it cooled. The next morning, I found the chain on the propane tank hanging loose. The padlock that kept it in place was still there, but the hasp was twisted like someone had tried to force it. There were scuffs in the dirt around it, not like animal prints but flat marks, maybe from boots. The thought stuck with me all day. I went over the area again after lunch, kneeling down to see if I could make sense of the tracks. The soil was packed and dry, and there were broken pine needles pressed into it. I didn't see any sign of a tire track on the road in, but that didn't mean much. If someone had walked in, I might never know until they were at the door. I told myself I was overthinking it. People sometimes wandered up here in summer, hunters or hikers who got turned around, but it was late in the season now. Still, I checked the door latch twice before bed and put the heavy wood bar across it, the one my uncle had made years ago for extra security. I kept the axe inside that night instead of leaving it by the woodpile. It must have been close to midnight when I heard the steps. They were slow, careful, not like an animal foraging, but like someone placing each foot deliberately. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves in between pauses. They circled the cabin. I lay still in the dark, my breathing shallow, feeling each hair on my arms stand up. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. The silence after was worse than the noise. I waited, straining to hear, but nothing followed. I didn't sleep again until the sky began to lighten. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. There were prints now unmistakable. Boots worn enough that the tread was smoothed in places. They led from the tree line to the corner of the cabin, around the back, and then back into the woods. I couldn't tell how long they'd been there before I saw them, but the dampness in the ground from the night had made them hold their shape. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but it was still early, and the drive back would mean hours of bad road and the highway. I tried to reason it out. Maybe someone had been curious. Maybe they were gone now, but the way they had walked around without coming to the door didn't feel right. That day, I kept busy. I split more wood than I needed, stacked it in tight rows along the wall, and checked the locks again. I made sure the lanterns were filled and the flashlight batteries were fresh. I even set a couple of old tin cans with small stones in them along the porch rail, a crude noise trap in case anyone came up that way. By dusk, I was on edge. I ate quickly and sat near the window that faced the road, though you could only see a few yards before the trees swallowed the view. It was after dark when the noises started again. First, the faint snap of a twig, then something brushing against the siding. The tin cans rattled once, sharp in the stillness, and I felt my chest tighten. I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I stood near the wall where I could see the window without being seen. A shadow passed across the pale moonlight outside, tall and narrow. It lingered, then moved away. Minutes passed. I thought maybe they had gone, but then there was a light, just a pinprick like the glow of a small flashlight, moving slowly along the side of the cabin. It stopped near the window and then went out. I didn't breathe until I was sure it was gone. The next morning, I found more prints. This time, they were closer, right up against the wall. The cans had been knocked to the ground, and one of the nails that held the porch screen was pulled loose. The lock on the shed was twisted. Nothing was taken, but the door had been tried. I could feel it now that whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were testing the place, seeing how easy it would be to get in. The fourth night was the worst. The sounds started earlier, just after sunset. Footsteps, more than one set now. The scrape of something against the doorframe. A dull thud, like a shoulder hitting wood. I sat in the dark with the axe across my lap, heart hammering, ears straining for every sound. They didn't try to force the door, but they stayed out there for hours, moving just enough to let me know they hadn't left. At one point, I heard the sound of breathing, close to the wall, steady and slow. Then it would move, circling again. It went on until the coldest part of the night, and then, as if on some silent signal, it stopped. When daylight came, I didn't waste time. I packed quickly, loaded the truck, and kept the axe within reach. The drive out felt longer than it should have. Every bend in the road seemed like a place someone could step out. I didn't see another car until I hit the main road miles later. Only then did I feel the tightness in my chest ease. I never went back to the cabin that season. In the spring, when I finally returned, the place was much as I had left it, except for one thing. On the porch rail, carved deep into the wood, was a single set of initials I didn't recognize. The edges of the carving were clean, fresh enough that they hadn't yet weathered. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, knowing that whoever had been out there that week hadn't just been passing by. They had wanted me to know they could come back. It was late October when I decided to spend a week alone in the small cabin I had bought earlier that year. The cabin sat deep in the woods, almost 2 hours from the nearest small town, and nearly a mile from the closest dirt road. I had been there before, but never alone for this long. The air was cold, the leaves had mostly turned brown, and the ground was covered with a thick layer of damp, fallen leaves that made every step sound softer than it really was. The sky was overcast that morning, with a pale gray light that made the whole forest seem quiet and flat. I had loaded my truck with enough food, water, and firewood for the week, though I knew the cabin had a hand pump for water outside and a propane heater inside. The first day felt calm. I spent time cleaning up the porch, sweeping away leaves, stacking firewood by the door. I walked around the cabin perimeter, checking the roof, the siding, and the windows. The place had been built in the late 70s, and though I had done some minor repairs when I bought it, it still had that old wood smell inside. The front door had a heavy bolt lock and a thick frame, and all 4 windows had metal latches. I always checked these things out of habit, especially since the cabin sat in a place where no one would hear you if something went wrong. By the afternoon, I started to feel that heavy stillness that comes with being deep in the woods with no background noise from cars or people. I made a small fire in the wood stove and boiled water for tea. The wind was picking up, making the trees creak and sway. I tried to read, but I kept looking at the window every few minutes. There was no reason to feel nervous, but my mind kept wandering to the idea of how far I really was from any help. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. I could hear the wind moving faster through the trees, and every now and then, a branch would snap somewhere out in the dark. I tried not to think much about it, but the sound carried differently out there. You could hear something moving a long way off, but you could never tell exactly how far away it was. I slept lightly, waking several times to listen. On the second morning, I decided to take a walk farther into the woods behind the cabin. I had a rough idea of the land's boundaries, but I hadn't explored the back part much. The ground there was soft and uneven, with old stumps hidden under thick brush. I found the remains of an old hunting blind about a half-mile in, just a platform nailed between 2 trees, the wood rotting away. I saw no fresh signs of human presence, no footprints, no cut logs, no trash. The only marks were deer tracks and a few claw marks low on a tree, likely from a black bear long ago. When I got back to the cabin around noon, I noticed something strange right away. In the damp patch of ground just off my porch, there were fresh boot prints. They were deep and clear, pointing toward my front steps. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. I knew they weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking shoes with a very different tread pattern. The prints looked like they were from a heavy boot, the kind with thick, wide soles. I tried to guess when they were made, but the edges were still sharp, meaning they couldn't be more than a few hours old. I walked around the cabin to see if there were any other tracks. On the side near the woods, there were more prints circling toward the back. They stopped just under the bedroom window before turning back toward the front yard. I looked at the window latch from inside. It was still locked, nothing broken, but the sight of those tracks made my stomach tighten. The rest of the day, I felt on edge. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see someone out there. By sunset, I had pushed a chair under the front door handle and made sure all the curtains were shut tight. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint crunching sound outside. It was slow, uneven, like someone stepping carefully on leaves. My heart started pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound moved toward the side of the cabin, then stopped. For several minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard a very faint scraping noise, like something brushing against the wall. I didn't sleep much after that. When daylight came, I went outside right away. The ground was covered with frost, and it didn't take long to find more boot prints, these ones fresher, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. They stopped again under the same bedroom window. The idea that someone had been standing there in the middle of the night made my skin crawl. I considered packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself it might just be a lost hiker or a hunter passing through. Still, I couldn't ignore how close they had come and how they circled my cabin. On the 4th day, the feeling of being watched never left me. Even in the middle of the day, when the sun managed to break through the clouds, I felt eyes on me. I tried to distract myself with small chores, splitting more firewood, sweeping the floor, reorganizing supplies, but my ears stayed tuned for every sound outside. That night was worse. Around 1 a.m., I heard the crunching again, closer this time. Then, a slow creak from the porch boards. My whole body tensed. I could hear the faint sound of the doorknob turning, just slightly, like someone testing it. I lay there frozen, staring at the door, watching the shadows from the fire flicker against the wood. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, followed by long, slow footsteps moving off into the woods. The first light, I found more tracks. This time they were right up against the porch, facing the door. My stomach turned when I saw the faint smudge near the doorknob, a dirty mark, like a thumbprint. I knew then that this wasn't some random passerby. Whoever it was had been watching me for days, coming closer each night. I couldn't figure out why they hadn't tried to break in yet. Maybe they were testing to see if I would leave or if I was armed. By the 5th night, I had my hatchet by my bed and kept the propane heater low so I could hear better without its constant hiss. The woods were dead silent for hours until I heard the crunching again, steady and slow. This time, it didn't stop at the porch. I heard the unmistakable sound of someone stepping onto it, then moving along it toward the side of the cabin. My heart hammered as I realized they were going toward the window again. Then a faint tap on the glass. Just one. Then another. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand hurt. Whoever it was stayed there for a long moment before walking away. I listened until I could no longer hear the footsteps, but I didn't move until sunrise. In the morning, the frost had been disturbed again under the window, the boot prints clearer than ever. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, keeping the hatchet nearby. As I carried my last bag to the truck, I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. I turned slowly toward the trees. Far back in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light, there was a figure, standing still, watching. I couldn't see the face, but I saw the dark shape of a heavy jacket and the outline of those same thick boots. I didn't stop to look longer. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and drove until I reached the main road. I didn't see the figure follow, but I checked the mirrors constantly. That was the last time I stayed at that cabin alone. When I came back weeks later with a friend, we found more prints in the soft earth near the back. Fresh ones. And under the window, pressed into the dirt, was the shape of 2 knees like someone had knelt there for a long time, looking in. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the pale winter light was starting to fade. The air was cold enough that every breath felt sharp in my lungs. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel for the last 2 hours along the winding, icy back roads. I could see my own tired eyes in the faint reflection of the truck's window as I turned off the ignition. The sound of the engine stopping felt strange, like I had just cut the only link between me and the rest of the world. The cabin sat about 50 yards from where I parked. It was surrounded by bare trees whose black, twisted branches clawed at the dull gray sky. The ground was frozen hard, covered in a thin sheet of snow that crunched loudly under my boots. I could smell the dry, sharp scent of the cold air mixed with a faint, earthy rot from leaves buried beneath the ice. Every step I took seemed to echo in the stillness. No wind, no animals, not even the sound of running water from the creek I knew was somewhere nearby. Just complete, heavy silence. I reached the front steps and felt the wood under my boots creak and groan. The cabin looked old but sturdy. The exterior logs were dark from years of weather, and the windows were framed with thick, warped wood that looked as if it had swollen from moisture over the years. My breath fogged in front of me as I set my bag down on the porch and fished out the keys. The lock was stiff and it took a bit of force to turn. When I finally opened the door, a wave of cold, stale air rolled out to meet me, smelling faintly of wood, dust, and something else I couldn't name, something old. Inside, the dim light from outside reached only a few feet past the doorway. I switched on the light by the door and was met with the warm yellow glow of an old bulb that took a moment to reach full brightness. The cabin's main room was simple. A heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, a small sofa, and a brick fireplace that looked like it had been used not too long ago. A thin layer of ash still rested in the pit. The floorboards were scratched and uneven, creaking with even the lightest step. My boots left a faint trail of melted snow behind me as I walked in. The kitchen was barely more than a counter, a sink, and a small stove with a couple of cupboards above it. The smell of old wood and dust was stronger here, mixed with the faint scent of stale cooking oil. I set my bag down on the table, my shoulders relaxing slightly now that I was inside and out of the cold. Still, there was a weight to the air that kept me from feeling comfortable. I checked the back door, which led to a small covered porch facing the woods. The lock was stiff but secure. The glass pane was fogged and streaked with frost on the edges, making the view of the forest beyond look hazy and distant. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the dark shapes of trees, the spaces between them filling with shadows as daylight continued to fade. After unpacking my bag and placing a few things on the table, a flashlight, a thermos, a map, and some snacks, I decided to get a fire going before the temperature dropped further. The woodpile outside was half buried in snow, but I managed to grab a few decent logs. The sound of them knocking together was dull and solid. Back inside, I stacked them in the fireplace and used some old newspaper and kindling from a basket nearby to start the fire. It took a few tries, my hands stiff from the cold, but soon enough I had a small flame that grew into a steady crackle. The heat was slow to spread, but just the sight of it was reassuring. As the fire built, I took a slow walk through the rest of the cabin. There was one small bedroom with a narrow bed against the wall, covered in a faded quilt. The mattress sagged in the middle. A dresser stood opposite the bed, its surface coated in a thin layer of dust except for a small, clean square where something must have sat until recently. I didn't see anything else out of place, but that clean square stuck in my mind. Next to the bedroom was a short hallway that led to a small bathroom. The sink was stained from years of use, and the mirror above it had black spots around the edges where the silver had worn away. The air in here felt colder, almost damp, and I could smell the faint, metallic scent of the old pipes. I returned to the main room and sat down at the table with my map. The cabin was deep in the woods, at least 15 miles from the nearest small town, and surrounded on all sides by thick forest and old logging roads. According to the map, there was a narrow trail running about a quarter-mile behind the cabin that led toward a frozen creek. Beyond that, just more woods. I had no plans to explore tonight. By the time I finished eating a quick meal, the last of the daylight was gone. The fire was burning stronger now, casting flickering shadows that swayed across the walls and ceiling. I kept the main light on but dimmed, letting the fire do most of the work. Outside, the world had turned completely black, and the windows reflected the inside of the cabin back at me like dark mirrors. I avoided looking at them for too long. It was sometime after 9 when I first noticed the sound. Faint, but distinct, a slow, deliberate crunching in the snow outside. At first, I thought it might be a branch falling, but it didn't stop. Came again. Crunch, pause, crunch. The sound carried in the still air, coming from somewhere beyond the back porch. My chest tightened. I stayed still, listening. The fire popped softly in the background. Another crunch came, closer this time. The kind of slow movement that didn't sound like an animal. Too heavy, too measured. I moved quietly to the kitchen and reached for the flashlight I had set down earlier. I kept the lights off in the back of the cabin and slowly approached the frosted window by the rear door. My breath made a small circle of fog on the glass as I peered out. The porch was empty. Beyond it, the tree line loomed, the snow on the ground faintly illuminated by the pale light of the moon filtering through the clouds. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Nothing moved. I stayed there for almost a minute, listening. Silence. I went back to the table, trying to focus on my map again, but I couldn't shake the feeling. My ears kept straining for the sound. After a while, I decided it must have been some branch shifting under the weight of snow or maybe a deer moving through the woods. The fire crackled on, the warmth slowly loosening my shoulders again. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I stoked the fire so it would last a while and turned off the main light, leaving only the faint orange glow from the fireplace. The bedroom was colder than the main room, and I could feel the chill seeping in from the corners. I lay down under the quilt, listening to the soft creaks of the cabin settling. Couldn't have been more than an hour later when I woke up. Not to a noise at first, but to the feeling, that prickling tension along my skin that something wasn't right. I stayed still, breathing slowly, my ears reaching into the silence. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like a weight shifting on the porch boards. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was on the back porch. The boards groaned again, slow and deliberate. I could hear the faintest brush of movement against the wall. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible, every step making the old floor protest softly. The cabin was dark now except for the faint embers in the fireplace. My flashlight was still on the table. I moved toward it, keeping low, trying not to make any sudden noise. Another slow creak came from the porch, then silence. When I reached the table, I picked up the flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. Instead, I crouched near the rear window, straining my eyes to see through the frost and faint moonlight. The glass showed nothing but vague shapes of trees and snow. No movement, no shadow. I waited. My breath was loud in the quiet. Then another sound, but this one from the side of the cabin. Slow steps in the snow circling. I went to the cabin because I needed to be alone for a while. It was in a remote part of the forest, miles from the nearest town, down a rough dirt track that was barely visible once the grass grew over it in summer. I had been there before with friends, but this time I was alone. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who rarely used it, and I had been told I could stay as long as I wanted. I brought enough supplies for a week: canned food, bottled water, a camping stove, batteries, and a sleeping bag. There was no electricity, no running water, and no phone signal. It was exactly the isolation I thought I wanted. The first day was quiet. I unpacked, swept the floor, and checked the windows and doors. The place was simple: one main room with a small table, a wood stove, and a single bed frame in the corner. Outside, the forest closed in tightly, the trees growing so close together that they blocked most of the sky. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. That night, the silence felt heavier than I remembered. There were no distant cars, no hum of electricity, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through the branches and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I read for a while by the light of a lantern, then turned in. Around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, but then I realized I had heard something. It wasn't the wind, it was sharper, more deliberate. A dry, snapping sound, like a footstep on twigs. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, closer. I told myself it was probably an animal. Out here, deer moved quietly but sometimes broke branches underfoot. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if I could spot any tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I saw marks, faint, but too large and spaced too evenly to be from a deer. They looked like boot prints. They led toward the back of the cabin, then vanished where the ground became hard and covered in pine needles. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it could have been an old trail from hunters or hikers passing through. The day passed slowly. I kept busy by chopping some firewood and exploring a little along the tree line, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. The woods felt different now. I noticed how dense they were, how easily someone could stand just a few yards away and be completely hidden. That night, I locked the cabin door and placed a heavy chair under the handle. I told myself I was being cautious. I kept the lantern lit longer than usual before turning it off. Again, I woke in the middle of the night. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard a slow, scraping sound along the side of the cabin. It started at one corner and moved along the wall, then stopped near the window. I stayed still, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The sound didn't come again, and after what felt like hours, I fell into a shallow, uneasy sleep. In the morning, I checked the wall outside. The wood was marked, fresh scratches in the outer boards, about waist high. They didn't look like animal marks. They were too straight, as if made by something metal dragged along the wall. By the third day, I no longer felt like I was there for peace and quiet. I was there waiting for something I couldn't see. I kept my hunting knife on the table next to me and moved the lantern closer when I sat at night. I stopped going into the trees and stayed near the cabin. That night, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, circling. They stopped and started, as if whoever it was knew I was listening. At one point, they came right up to the door. The sound of weight shifting on the wooden step made the boards creak. I held my breath, gripping the knife, staring at the dark outline of the door. After a while, the sound faded, and I stayed awake until morning. On the fourth day, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my gear as soon as the sun came up, but I realized the only way back to my car was the narrow dirt track. And if someone had been watching me, they would know I had to use it. I waited until midday, thinking I would have the best light to leave. When I finally stepped outside with my pack, the forest felt too quiet. I kept glancing around, my grip tight on the strap of my bag. Halfway down the track, I saw it, fresh boot prints in the mud, heading toward the cabin from the opposite direction. The prints were deep, spaced as if the person had been walking slowly. I didn't stop to think. I pushed on fast, my breathing hard. Every so often I thought I heard something behind me, a faint crunch of leaves, but when I turned, the track was empty. It felt like the trees were pressing in closer, the shadows darker even in daylight. When I finally reached the clearing where my car was parked, I saw movement at the edge of the trees on the far side. Just a figure partly hidden, standing still. I didn't look long enough to see details. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The road twisted through the forest for miles before reaching the highway, and I didn't relax until I was surrounded by other cars. Even then, it didn't feel like the end of it. Whoever had been out there had known I was alone, had circled the cabin at night, had come right to the door. They hadn't tried to break in. They had just stayed close enough to let me know they were there. I never went back to the cabin. The next time the relative mentioned it, I said it was too far and too quiet for me. But sometimes at night, in my own bed, I wake up thinking I hear footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the walls. It was early October when I decided to spend a week alone in the small wooden cabin I had rented deep in the forest. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest small town, with no neighbors nearby and no proper road leading to it. Only a long, narrow dirt path that wound through thick pine and birch trees. I had chosen it because I wanted some quiet time away from everything. Away from work, away from people, away from the noise of the city. I thought a week in the woods would help clear my head. The drive there had taken longer than I expected because the dirt road was rough, filled with dips and rocks, and I had to go slow to avoid damaging my car. By the time I finally parked beside the cabin, the sun was already dropping behind the tree line, and the air had that sharp, cool feeling that comes right before full darkness. The cabin was small, with a single floor, built from thick logs that looked like they had been cut and placed decades ago. The roof was dark brown metal sheets, and there was a single porch with 2 old wooden chairs. Behind the cabin was a small shed and an even smaller outhouse. The rental listing had warned that there was no plumbing inside, only a hand pump for water and a wood-burning stove for heat. Electricity came from a small generator that the owner kept in the shed. I unpacked quickly, moving my bags inside. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and cold ashes from the stove. The main room had a bed pushed up against one wall, a table and 2 chairs, and the stove in the corner. There were 2 windows in the front, one on each side of the door, and a single window in the back wall. All of them had thick curtains. After a quick look around, I stepped back outside to get more firewood from the shed before it got too dark. The shed door creaked loudly when I opened it, and the inside smelled of fuel from the generator. Stacks of cut logs were piled against one wall. I carried several armfuls inside the cabin, placing them in a neat pile next to the stove. By the time I lit the first fire, the sky had gone almost black, with only a faint deep blue glow left in the west. I turned on the generator so I could have some light inside while I ate. The sound of the small engine was a steady hum coming from the shed, mixing with the soft crackle of the fire. The first night was quiet. I sat at the table, eating a simple meal I had brought with me, and listened to the wind brushing against the trees outside. Every now and then, a twig snapped in the forest, but it didn't bother me. I knew animals roamed around here. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear if I was unlucky. When I went to bed, I shut off the generator and let the fire die down to a low glow. The cabin was completely dark, and the silence was deep. I remember lying there for a long time before falling asleep, listening to the faint shifting of the wood as it cooled. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight was coming through the gaps in the curtains, and the air inside was cold enough that I could see my breath. I got up, dressed quickly, and restarted the fire to warm the place. After making coffee, I stepped outside. The forest was covered in a thin mist, the ground damp with dew. The air smelled fresh and sharp, and somewhere far away, I could hear a woodpecker tapping. I walked around the cabin, taking in the surroundings. The dirt road I had driven up was barely visible now, swallowed by the trees. I spent most of that first day gathering wood, checking my supplies and getting used to the quiet. In the afternoon, I hiked a short distance into the woods, following a faint trail. I didn't go too far because I didn't want to get lost. That night, after dinner, I sat on the porch for a while. The forest was dark except for the pale glow of the moon above the treetops. The sound of crickets was steady, but every now and then it would stop for a moment before starting again, as if something had passed by in the distance. It wasn't until the third night that things began to feel strange. I had been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had gone out completely, and the cabin was ice cold. The moonlight through the curtains gave the room a faint silver glow. I lay still, listening. That was when I realized the forest outside was completely silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Then I heard it. A faint, slow crunching of footsteps on the gravel and leaves outside. They were steady, deliberate, and coming from the side of the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time closer to the front. I stared toward the door, half expecting to see the knob turn, but nothing happened. The steps moved past the front and around to the other side. I lay there, every muscle tense, trying to figure out if it could just be an animal. But the sound was too slow, too heavy, spaced exactly like someone walking on two legs. After maybe a minute, the steps faded into the distance toward the trees. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I got up quietly, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked through the side window. The beam lit up a small patch of trees, but I saw nothing. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was scattered with pine needles, making it hard to see tracks, but near the side wall, in a bare patch of dirt, I saw what looked like the faint imprint of a boot heel. It wasn't clear enough to be sure, but it didn't look like any animal track. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, maybe a deer moving strangely. Still, the thought that someone might be wandering around out here bothered me. The fourth day was cold and overcast. I spent most of it inside, reading. Every so often, I glanced out the window toward the trees. Nothing moved except for the occasional bird. That night, I made sure the fire was strong before going to bed. I left the flashlight next to me. Sometime deep into the night, I woke again to the same silence. My skin prickled immediately. Then I heard it, the crunch of steps, slow and heavy, moving from the back of the cabin toward the shed. I stayed completely still, my ears straining. There was a faint metallic sound, like someone touching the shed's latch. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. This time, I didn't even try to look outside. I just lay there, heart pounding, until the faint light of dawn came through the curtains. In the morning, I checked the shed. The door was still closed, but the latch had fresh scratches, as if someone had been messing with it. I didn't remember seeing those before. From that point on, I couldn't relax. Every noise outside made me tense. I kept the flashlight with me at all times. On the sixth night, it escalated. I was in bed, drifting towards sleep, when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow, circling the cabin. Then they stopped right outside my bedroom wall. For several minutes, there was nothing. Then a faint tapping sound began, right on the wooden wall, almost at head height. 3 slow taps, then silence, then 3 more. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling. The tapping stopped after a while, and I heard the steps move toward the trees again. The final night was the worst. I had already decided I would leave in the morning. I packed most of my things before bed so I could go quickly. I left the fire burning high and the flashlight on the table. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the shed door opening. The creak was loud and unmistakable. Then came the sound of something being dragged across the ground, something heavy. The footsteps came back, slower this time, toward the front porch. I could hear the boards of the porch creak under the weight. Then the doorknob turned slowly, but the lock held. For a long minute, whoever it was just stood there, trying the knob every few seconds. Then the sound stopped, and the porch creaked again as they stepped away. I stayed awake until sunrise, gripping the flashlight, ready to run if I had to. When the first light came, I loaded my things into the car as fast as I could. I glanced at the shed one last time as I started the engine. The door was hanging open, and inside, one of the long rusted tools was lying on the ground, as if it had been dropped. I drove away without looking back, the dirt road stretching ahead through the trees. I didn't stop until I was back in town. For days afterward, I kept thinking about the sound of those slow footsteps circling the cabin at night. I never saw who it was. I never found out why they came. But I know they were there, watching, waiting, moving closer each time. I drove up the mountain road in the late afternoon, the sun already beginning to drop behind the tall ridges to my left. The road was narrow and winding, carved into the slope, with one side pressed against thick forest and the other dropping steeply into a valley where I could see a thin, twisting river glinting in the fading light. The cabin I had rented was supposed to be a good distance from any other home, something I had specifically wanted. I wasn't looking for tourist comfort or the kind of cabin that came with a hot tub and satellite TV. I wanted quiet. I wanted distance from people. The air outside looked hazy, the way it sometimes does when the sun hits certain angles and lights up dust in the air. I kept my windows closed as I climbed higher. There was a sense of being far from anything. My phone signal had already died several miles back, leaving only the small blue on my map app stuck in one last known position before it froze completely. From here on, I was driving blind except for the printed directions I had in the passenger seat. The asphalt road turned to gravel after a while, and the crunch of tires against loose stone made the ride rougher. Tall pines stood on either side, their trunks dark and narrow, their branches high above where little light filtered through. I passed no cars coming down, no hikers, no signs of anyone. Just the same steady roll forward, the engine humming, and the feeling that every turn was taking me deeper away from the world I knew. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low enough to turn the light gold. The building sat in a small clearing, surrounded by forest on all sides. It was old but sturdy looking, built from thick logs that had darkened over time. The roof sloped steeply, with a metal chimney pipe poking out near the top. A small porch wrapped around the front, with 2 steps leading up. There was no sign of anyone having been here recently, no footprints in the dirt, no tire marks on the narrow pull-off beside it. I killed the engine and stepped out. The silence was immediate and heavy. No hum of distant cars, no voices, not even the sound of wind at first. Just still air, the faint smell of pine sap, and the occasional creak of wood as the cabin seemed to settle in the cooling evening. Inside, the place was simple. One main room with a wood stove against the far wall, a small kitchen area to the left, and a doorway leading to what I guessed was the bedroom. The floorboards were worn and uneven in spots. There was a faint smell of old wood and dust. The air felt cool, not damp, but with that closed-up scent a place gets when it hasn't been opened in a while. I set my bag down and checked each window. The locks were simple latches. The glass had a slight ripple to it, like it had been there for decades. I tried the back door and found it locked. I noted the way it stuck slightly in the frame, the kind of thing that might make it hard to open quickly if I ever needed to. As the light faded outside, the woods seemed to pull in closer. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood like dark walls. When I lit a single lamp in the main room, its glow only reached so far, and beyond the windows everything was already black. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, because there was something about the stillness that made me want to move carefully. That first night, the quiet wasn't quite as complete as I thought it would be. The cabin made sounds of its own, small, sharp pops from the cooling wood, the faint groan of beams, the whisper of wind slipping through gaps somewhere unseen. Around midnight, I thought I heard something else, something outside. It was faint enough that it might have been a branch shifting under its own weight, or the sound of small claws against bark. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if it was worth getting up to check. I didn't. Morning light came in weak through the trees. I made coffee on the small propane stove and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold enough to see my breath. The forest seemed unchanged, exactly as it had been the night before, as if time didn't move the same way here. I didn't plan to hike far that day, just walk the perimeter of the clearing, maybe follow the old logging track I'd seen a short way back. The track was overgrown in places, with weeds pushing up through the old ruts. I followed it for maybe half a mile, hearing nothing but my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of something small in the brush. When I turned back, I noticed something I hadn't on the way out, a shape at the far edge of the clearing near the cabin. It was dark and low to the ground, unmoving. My first thought was that it might be a stump, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't wood. It was a piece of black fabric, tangled in some low branches. It looked like part of a jacket, heavy, torn, and weather-worn. The edges were frayed, and there was dried mud caked into the folds. I picked it up, turned it over, and saw no label. I didn't see any other items nearby, no bag or signs of camping gear. Just the jacket, half hidden in the undergrowth. Back inside the cabin, I left it on the porch railing, thinking maybe I'd take it into town when I left. But it stayed in my mind all day. How far from the road had I been when I found it? Who would have been out here? That night, the noises outside came again, but closer. They were faint but steady, a slow movement, like something stepping through grass just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stayed very still, trying to hear patterns in the sound. The steps would come, then pause, then come again. Not a deer. Too slow for that. Too deliberate. I thought about the jacket again. I thought about the fact that no one knew I was here, and my phone still had no service. The third night, I decided not to turn on the lamp. I sat in the dark near the window, letting my eyes adjust, staring out at the black wall of trees. First, there was nothing, just stillness. Then, after maybe an hour, I saw a shape move between two trees. It was quick, but I caught the outline, upright, human-sized. It didn't come closer. It just shifted from one spot to another, then was still again. I stayed awake until dawn, and when the light finally came, I walked to that part of the clearing. There were marks in the grass, faint but there, flattened spots where someone had stood, a narrow trail leading back into the woods. I didn't follow it far. By the fourth day, the unease had settled into something heavier. Every sound made me stop what I was doing. Every shift of shadow outside the window caught my eye. I kept the wood stove going even when it wasn't needed, just for the noise. I thought about leaving early, but the drive down the mountain would take hours, and I kept telling myself I might be imagining more than was really there. That night, I woke to the sound of the back door latch rattling. Not loudly, just a faint metallic click, like someone testing it. I didn't move at first. Then I sat up slowly, heart pounding, straining to hear more. The latch clicked again, then stopped. After a minute, there was the sound of steps moving away across the porch. I stayed awake until morning, then went out to check. The dirt outside the back door was disturbed, the faint outline of a boot print visible in the soft ground. Not mine. By the sixth night, I knew someone was out there. They never came during the day, never left anything obvious, but the noises always returned after dark. Sometimes the steps circled the cabin slowly, stopping at certain points. Sometimes there was nothing but silence, which felt worse because it meant I didn't know where they were. That final night, the steps came again, but faster, more purposeful. They came to the front porch, stopped, then moved to the side of the cabin. There was a heavy thud, like something hitting the wall, then another. I stayed in the bedroom, holding my breath, until the sound stopped. The first light, I opened the door. On the porch railing was the jacket I had left there days ago. It had been folded neatly. That was enough. I packed my bag in minutes, threw it into the truck, and left without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and I didn't breathe fully until I saw other cars again. I never found out who it was. I don't think I ever want to, but I know for certain I wasn't alone out there, and the cabin hasn't felt quiet in my memory since. I had been looking forward to getting away from the noise of the city for months. My work had been grinding me down, and I wanted nothing more than a few quiet days in the woods, away from traffic, phones, and the constant movement of people. I had found a small cabin rental online, tucked deep into a place called Pine Hollow. From the photos, it looked old but well kept. It was surrounded by trees so thick that even in the middle of the day, the light only broke through in narrow beams. It had no internet, no television, and just a basic kitchen and bed. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took most of the day. The further I went, the narrower the road became, winding through hills and dense forest. For the last hour, I didn't see another car. The air seemed heavier there, like it carried more moisture, and it smelled of wet leaves and pine. When I finally reached the dirt path that led to the cabin, my tires crunched over stones and fallen branches. The trees closed in from both sides, their tops leaning toward each other so much that they almost formed a tunnel. The path was only wide enough for one vehicle, and the branches scraped lightly against my windows as I drove. The cabin sat in a small clearing, just big enough for the building and a patch of overgrown grass in front. It was made of weathered wood that had turned gray in places from years of rain. The roof looked solid enough, but the porch sagged a little at one end. There was a single window facing the front and a smaller one on the side, but both were covered by thick curtains. There was no sound other than the wind pushing gently through the trees and the distant creak of the wooden porch as I stepped onto it. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The main room had a small table, a chair, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a bed against the wall. The kitchen was only a counter with a sink and a small propane stove. The water came from a pump outside. Everything felt quiet, but not in a relaxing way. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of every sound your own body made. Your breathing, the way your shoes scuffed the floor, the small clicks in your joints when you moved. I unpacked my bag slowly, trying to get used to the space. My plan was to stay for 3 nights. I didn't plan on doing much other than reading, taking walks in the woods, and maybe writing a little. There was an old armchair near the window that looked comfortable enough for reading, so I placed my book there for later. The sun was already dipping low when I went outside to pump water into a jug. The air was colder than I expected for the time of year. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could hear the pump handle squeak with each pull. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked loudly. Not the quick snap of a small twig, but something heavier. I froze for a moment and looked into the trees, but the shadows between them made it impossible to see far. After a minute, I went back inside. I made a simple dinner of canned soup and bread and sat at the table. As I ate, I noticed how dark the woods had become outside the window. The clearing around the cabin seemed like a small island surrounded by blackness. The air felt heavier again, like it was pressing against the walls. When night fully came, it was absolute. The kind of dark where you can't see your own hand without a light. I lit the small oil lamp on the table and read for a while, but the silence outside kept breaking my focus. Every so often, I'd hear something faint, a rustle of leaves, a dull thud like something falling onto damp ground. I told myself it was just normal forest sounds. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were closer than they should have been. Around midnight, I decided to sleep. The bed's mattress was thin, but I was tired enough not to care. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark. For a while, all I heard was the faint ticking of the cooling stove. Then came another sound, something moving just outside the cabin. Started faint, like a light step in the grass. Then another. They weren't quick or hurried, but spaced apart as if whoever or whatever was out there was moving slowly, deliberately. My first thought was a deer, but the steps seemed heavier. I held my breath, trying to judge their distance. They seemed to be circling. I didn't move. The steps would fade for a while, then return on the other side of the cabin. Once, I thought I heard the sound of something brushing lightly against the wall, like fingertips or fur. Then there was a long pause. The air inside the cabin felt cold, though the stove still gave off heat. After what felt like an hour, I heard a soft creak from the porch, the same sound it made earlier when I'd stepped on it. Then, faintly, the wood near the front door gave another creak, this one sharper. I was wide awake now, my eyes straining to see in the dark. I thought about turning on the lamp, but something in me resisted. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The porch went silent again, but not for long. There came a sound like slow pressure against the door, a slight shift in the frame. Then nothing. I stayed like that, still barely breathing for what could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, the sounds stopped completely. I didn't sleep at all. When the first pale light came through the curtains, I finally moved. My muscles ached from lying stiff for so long. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly. The clearing looked the same as before. No footprints in the grass, though the ground was too firm to hold them well. Still, something felt wrong. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. On the far side of the cabin, just beneath the side window, the grass was pressed down in a long, narrow shape, like someone had lain there for a while. I spent the day trying to convince myself it was nothing. I walked the trail near the cabin, read my book in the chair, pumped more water, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But every time I glanced at the pressed grass, a weight settled in my stomach. I considered packing up and leaving early, but I told myself that would be overreacting. The second night came faster than I wanted. I kept the lamp on for longer, reading in the chair by the window. Outside, the dark seemed even heavier. The noises began earlier this time. Faint rustles, spaced footsteps. I tried to ignore them, but then I heard something new. A slow drag, like fabric or rope being pulled over the ground. I stood near the window, careful not to get too close. The sound came from the far edge of the clearing, but I couldn't see anything beyond the black shapes of trees. The dragging stopped, then came the soft creak of the porch again. My skin prickled. I backed away from the window and sat on the bed, staring at the door. The air felt colder again. The creak came once more, followed by another closer. Then a faint scraping against the wood, low down, near the bottom of the door. I didn't sleep that night either. When morning came, I found nothing on the porch except for a small, thin piece of frayed rope lying near the step. It was damp and had bits of dirt clinging to it. I didn't know what to think. The third and final night, I kept the lamp burning low and sat in the chair with my bag packed beside me. I had decided that if anything happened again, I'd leave before morning. It did happen again. Around midnight, the dragging sound came back, slower than before. Then the footsteps, circling the cabin in the same deliberate way. I stayed still, but my heart was pounding. The dragging stopped right outside the front door. Then came the softest, slowest tap against the wood, not knocking, but like the end of a finger testing the surface. A pause, another tap, then silence. I didn't move until the first light came. I walked outside with my bag, not looking back at the cabin. As I reached my car, I glanced at the ground near the porch. The grass there was pressed down again, but this time it stretched out in two shapes, one long and narrow like before, and another beside it shorter, as if someone had been lying next to the first. I drove without stopping until I reached the main road. I never found out who or what had been out there, but I know I wasn't alone in Pine Hollow, and I know they knew exactly where I was. I had been driving for almost 6 hours when I finally turned off the main road and onto the narrow gravel path that led to the cabin. The sun was dipping low behind the trees, and the air had that heavy stillness that comes just before night. My arms felt sore from gripping the steering wheel for so long, and my back ached from the stiff seat. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The idea was simple. 2 nights in a small, quiet cabin away from the city. No phone, no work, no noise. Just me, the woods, and the sound of the wind. The gravel path twisted and turned, lined on both sides by tall pine and spruce trees that reached so high they blocked much of the fading light. I slowed the car, letting the tires crunch slowly over the uneven ground. The trees closed in the deeper I went, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel. I hadn't passed another car for miles. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin sat exactly as it had been in the listing photos. Small, single-story, with dark wood siding and a metal roof that looked worn from weather. A short set of wooden steps led to the front door, and to the left was a small shed, its door slightly warped from age. Beyond the cabin, the land dropped steeply into a ravine thick with trees. I killed the engine, and the sudden quiet felt almost too big. There wasn't even the hum of distant traffic, just the faint sound of wind moving through the treetops and the ticking sound of the car's cooling engine. I stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was colder than I expected. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean. A single room served as both kitchen and living space, with a small table in the center and an old wood stove against one wall. A short hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The windows were small, and the light coming in was already dim. I set my bags down and went back to the car to bring in the rest. By the time I was unpacked, night had come quickly. The trees outside were just black shapes against a darkening sky. I lit the oil lamp on the table, the yellow glow making the shadows in the corners seem thicker. I made a simple meal from what I'd brought: bread, cheese, and canned soup heated on the stove. The cabin was quiet except for the faint creak of wood as it settled in the cooling air. After eating, I stepped outside for a moment. The cold air hit my face sharply. The darkness in the trees felt different now, deeper, harder to look into. I could hear water running somewhere far off, maybe a stream down in the ravine. I stood there for a while, listening, but after a few minutes the stillness began to feel heavy, like the night was pressing in on me. I went back inside and locked the door. The first strange sound came just after midnight. I had been lying in bed, reading by flashlight, when I heard it. A single sharp crack from outside, like a stick breaking underfoot. I froze, holding my breath. At first I told myself it was just a branch falling, maybe a squirrel. But then came another sound, closer this time. The crunch of leaves under slow, deliberate steps. I turned off the flashlight and lay still in the dark. The steps came again, slow and spaced far apart, moving around the cabin. I could picture someone circling the walls just beyond the thin wood, their feet dragging slightly in the leaves. I waited for it to stop, but the sounds went on for what felt like several minutes, shifting from one side of the cabin to the other. Then, nothing. I stayed awake for a long time, straining to hear any more movement. Eventually, I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. In the morning, I told myself it had been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But when I went outside, I saw the ground was too disturbed for that. There were shoe prints in the damp earth. Not boots like mine, but sneakers, the tread faint but clear enough to see. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin, and then led back into the woods. The rest of the day, I tried to keep busy. I went for a short walk along the path, gathered some firewood, and read on the porch for a while. But I kept finding myself glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. The prints were still in the dirt by the steps when I came back from my walk, and I found myself checking them more than once, as if they might change. By late afternoon, clouds had moved in, and the wind picked up. The woods began to feel different, restless, like something was moving through them. I cooked dinner early, more for something to do than because I was hungry. The light faded quickly, and soon it was just the lamplight again, flickering against the walls. That night, the noises came back. This time I was ready for them. I sat in the dark, the lamp turned off, listening. First there was the faint rustle of leaves, then the same slow steps as before moving around the cabin. I heard the sound of someone brushing against the outer wall, the faint scrape of fabric on wood. At one point there was a soft thud, like a hand pressing against the siding. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. The steps paused near the bedroom window, then shifted again toward the front of the cabin. I thought I heard a quiet inhale, almost too soft to notice. Then the sound of retreating footsteps, fading toward the trees. I barely slept that night. When dawn came, I checked outside again. The same footprints were there, fresh in the damp soil. The tracks came closer to the window this time. By the third night, I was exhausted from lack of sleep. My nerves were raw, and every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I considered leaving early, but the long drive back through the dark woods seemed worse than staying. I told myself I'd keep the oil lamp burning all night, that maybe the light would be enough to keep whoever it was away. It wasn't. Just after midnight, I heard the steps again. But this time they came quickly, in short bursts, like someone moving with more purpose. There was a brief silence, and then a metallic rattle from the front door handle. My throat went dry. The handle turned slightly, then stopped, then turned again harder. The old metal latch inside held, but I could hear the faint sound of breathing on the other side of the door. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the table and stood in the center of the room, not daring to go closer. The rattling stopped. Then I heard quick steps moving along the porch and away from the cabin. The rest of the night passed in tense, silent hours. I kept the flashlight in my hand until the first light of morning. When I finally stepped outside, I saw something new. On the porch, right in front of the door, was a single, freshly broken branch, about a foot long, placed neatly in the center of the boards. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I packed everything quickly, loaded the car, and drove out without looking back. The gravel path seemed even narrower on the way out, the trees closing in as if to keep me there. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I feel like I could breathe normally again. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who or what kind of person had been walking circles around it in the dark. But I know this much: those weren't random footsteps, and they weren't curious animals. Whoever it was knew I was there, and they wanted me to know it too. It was early in the fall when I decided to spend a few days alone in the old cabin. The place sat far back in the woods, away from any main road, with a dirt path that twisted for miles before ending at a small clearing. The cabin had been in the family for years, though no one had used it much since my uncle passed away. I had been there only a few times before, always with other people, never on my own. I wanted the quiet, the kind you can't get in town, and I thought a week out here might clear my head. I parked the truck near the edge of the clearing, right where the grass grew higher and the dirt turned soft. From there, I could see the dark wood siding of the cabin, the small tin chimney bent slightly from years of wind, and the single porch step that creaked every time someone used it. The trees pressed in on all sides, tall pines and maples with leaves just starting to turn. The air had that dry, crisp smell that comes before the real cold sets in. I could hear nothing but the faint wind moving through the branches and a few distant crows calling somewhere far back in the trees. The cabin door stuck a little when I pushed it open. The inside was dim, with light falling in through two small windows on the front wall. Dust hung in the air, lit up by the sunlight in thin, drifting lines. The floor was uneven in places, boards worn smooth from years of footsteps. Against one wall sat an old wood stove, blackened from years of use, with a small pile of split logs stacked beside it. The table in the corner still had a few scratches and burns from my uncle's old cooking habits. I set my bag down on it and walked slowly around the room, trying to get used to the silence. There was only one bedroom, small and narrow, with a single bed frame and a mattress that sagged a little in the middle. A faded wool blanket lay folded at the foot. A dresser with one missing drawer stood against the wall. The only other room was a tiny bathroom my uncle had added years ago with a hand pump for water. The place was simple, quiet, and a little colder than I remembered. I spent the first hour cleaning, sweeping away dust and clearing out a few dead leaves that had blown in through the cracks near the windows. I unpacked my food, cans, bread, some fruit, and a cooler with meat and milk, and set it all on the counter near the sink. My plan was simple: cook, read, take walks in the woods, and just stay away from people for a while. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the stove, ate a quiet dinner, and went to bed early. I could hear the wind outside through the thin walls, and every so often something, maybe a branch, would scrape against the side of the cabin. It didn't bother me much. I had grown up in the country and was used to night sounds. The second day, I decided to take a long walk deeper into the woods behind the cabin. I followed an old logging trail for a while before cutting across a ridge that overlooked a low valley. I didn't see any signs of people, no boot prints, no litter, which made me think no one had been out here for a long time. I stayed out for hours, not heading back until the sun was already dropping low. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was almost dark, and the cold had settled in fast. That night, I noticed something that made me uneasy. When I went outside to bring in more firewood, I saw what looked like a set of footprints in the dirt just off to the left of the porch. They weren't mine. I had come from the other direction when I arrived. They were spaced far apart, the impressions deep like someone heavier had walked through. They led toward the trees and stopped where the ground turned to thick grass. I told myself they could have been there before I got here, maybe from a hunter passing through, but the dirt had been soft from a bit of rain earlier in the week, and the edges of the prints looked sharp and fresh. I tried not to think much of it and went back inside. But I locked the door before bed, something I hadn't bothered to do the night before. The third morning was colder. I could see my breath when I woke. I lit the stove and warmed my hands over it while I made breakfast. When I stepped outside to check on the truck, I noticed something else. A small piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch near the edge of the clearing. It looked like it had come from a jacket, dark green or brown, frayed on one edge. Again, I told myself it could be from an old hunter or hiker who passed through long before me, but the idea didn't sit well. I spent most of the day inside, reading and writing in a notebook I'd brought. Around mid-afternoon, I thought I heard something from outside, a faint, steady crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze listening, but it stopped after a few seconds. When I went to the window, I didn't see anyone, just the tree line and the thick shadow under the pines. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, thinking I'd heard something. Once, just before dawn, I thought I heard a slow dragging sound along the porch boards. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling until it was fully light. On the fourth day, I seriously thought about leaving. The silence felt heavier now, like it was pressing in. I walked out to the truck just to make sure it would start if I needed it. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The passenger side door was not fully shut. I was certain I had closed it tight when I parked. I looked inside. Nothing seemed missing, but my glove box was open. The small flashlight I had kept there was gone. At that point, I knew someone had been around the cabin. Maybe they were just passing through, maybe they had no bad intentions, but the thought of someone quietly coming that close without me hearing them made my skin crawl. That night, I kept the lantern on low and sat in the main room, listening. Hours passed. The wind picked up. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of a footstep on the porch. Slow, careful. Then another. My hands went cold. I didn't move, just stared at the door. There was no knock, no sound of the handle. Just that slow weight shifting on the boards. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, my body stiff from sitting in the same position. By the fifth morning, I was done. I packed my bag, loaded it into the truck, and was about to start the engine when I noticed something lying on the porch where I had heard the steps. It was my flashlight, the one that had been missing from the truck. The batteries were gone. I drove out of there without looking back. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said I'd cut the trip short, but I kept thinking about it. The footprints, the torn fabric, the open truck door, the missing flashlight. Someone had been out there watching, maybe waiting. And the worst part was knowing that whoever it was had been close enough to touch the cabin without me hearing a thing until they wanted me to. I never went back to that cabin again. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The plan was simple. I would take some time off from work, drive out into the mountains, and stay in a small wooden cabin I had rented online. It was supposed to be a break from people, noise, and screens. I wanted quiet mornings with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees, long afternoons reading and walking, and nights where I could sit on the porch and hear nothing but the distant rush of the river. I packed a cooler of food, a sleeping bag, some basic tools, and my hiking boots. I didn't overthink it. I just wanted peace. The drive took almost 6 hours. The last hour was on a narrow dirt road, climbing higher and higher into pine forest. The cabin was exactly as pictured, small with a slanted tin roof, a porch with 2 old wooden chairs, and a stack of firewood by the side. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by trees so thick that the sunlight only came through in broken patches. There was no one around. No other cabins, no vehicles, no power lines in sight. Just the cabin, the trees, and the wind. The inside was basic, wood floors, a small table, 1 chair, a narrow bed against the wall, and a black iron stove in the corner for heat. There was a shelf with some old pots and pans, a lantern, and a small cupboard for food. There was no running water, but there was a hand pump about 20 feet from the porch, right next to the tree line. Everything smelled of pine and dust. I unpacked my cooler into the cupboard, set my sleeping bag on the bed, and put my flashlight and knife where I could reach them easily. The first day was uneventful. I walked down a small trail that led to the river, maybe 15 minutes away. The water was cold and fast, and there were tracks in the mud along the bank. Deer, maybe raccoon. I stayed near the cabin when the sun began to drop, started a small fire in the stove, and read until I felt sleepy. That night was colder than I expected, and the silence was so complete that every creak of the cabin felt loud. But it wasn't unpleasant. It just made me more aware of how far away I was from everything. The second day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I didn't bring my phone because there was no signal anyway, but I brought a small pack with water, a snack, and my compass. The trees closed in quickly, the light dim even though the sky was clear. I followed deer trails and dry creek beds, marking the turns in my head. A couple of hours in, I found something strange. A half-collapsed wooden shed, maybe from an old logging camp. It was empty except for some rusted metal cans and a broken axe handle. The ground around it was churned up, as if animals had been digging there. I didn't linger. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already lowering behind the trees. I made a small fire outside to cook, then went inside when the air got colder. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning, not sure why. The cabin was dark, except for the faint orange glow of the stove. I heard something outside, not close but not far either. It was a slow, steady sound, like footsteps in the leaves. Then it stopped. I sat still in bed, listening hard. After a while, I convinced myself it was just an animal passing through and went back to sleep. The third day started with thin fog in the clearing. The trees looked darker through it, and drops of water fell from the branches. I decided to stay near the cabin, cutting some kindling and checking the pump. Around midday, I heard something again, different this time. A sharp metallic noise, like metal scraping on metal, came from somewhere past the pump, deep in the trees. I stood still for a while, waiting to hear it again, but it didn't repeat. I told myself it could be anything, old metal from that shed, maybe swaying in the wind. That night, I made sure to bolt the cabin door. I kept the lantern low, sitting on the bed and reading. I heard the sound again, faintly metal scraping, then silence. This time, it felt closer. I got up quietly, turned the lantern off, and listened in the dark. The sound came once more, then stopped. I stayed awake a long time, but nothing else happened. On the fourth day, the air was warmer. I went down to the river again, filled my water container, and sat there for a while. The trees on the other side looked even thicker, the shadows darker. I felt watched, though I saw nothing. When I came back, I noticed something small but strange. The dirt near the pump looked disturbed, like someone had stepped there recently. I hadn't gone to the pump yet that day. The prints weren't animal, they were faint, but they looked like the front edge of a boot sole. That night was when things changed. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard movement again. This time, it wasn't out in the trees. It was on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps would creaking under weight. My heart started hammering. The steps stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, faint but human. Then, a very light sound, like fingers brushing the wood of the door. I stayed absolutely still, gripping the knife under my pillow. After what felt like forever, the sound moved away, slow steps back across the porch, then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I opened the door and looked at the porch. There were marks in the dust, faint outlines of boots. They came from the far side, stopped at the door, then turned back. I walked the edge of the clearing, scanning the ground. The prints went toward the trees, then vanished on harder soil. I didn't like the idea of leaving, but I also didn't like the idea of staying. My car was parked a few minutes down the trail, hidden under trees. I decided to keep my pack ready from now on. That day, I stayed alert, checking the clearing every hour. Nothing happened until late afternoon, when I saw something out of place in the trees. A darker shape, almost blending in, but not quite. It was still. I kept looking at it, and after a moment it shifted slightly, like someone leaning. Then it was gone. I couldn't be sure if it was a trick of the light, but I was sure I had seen movement. That night, I left the lantern off completely and sat near the stove with the knife. Hours passed. Then, the sound came again. Footsteps, this time circling the cabin slowly. Every few minutes they stopped, then started again, always in a different place. Once, I heard the faint metallic scrape again, just outside the window. I stayed in the dark, hardly breathing. The sounds went on for what felt like hours before fading into the distance. By the fifth morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed everything quickly, listening for any sound outside. When I opened the door, the clearing was silent. I stepped onto the porch, and that's when I saw it. Wedged between two planks of the railing was a strip of dark cloth, torn and frayed, like from a jacket. I didn't touch it. I went straight to the car, loaded my bag, and started down the dirt road. Half an hour later, in the rearview mirror, I saw a figure step out from the trees into the road where I had just driven. It was too far to see clearly, but it was tall, still, and facing my direction. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until the dirt road became asphalt, and I didn't look back again. When I got home, I kept thinking about the sounds, the prints, the cloth, and that figure in the road. Whoever it was, they had been there more than once. They had walked right up to the door in the middle of the night. They had circled the cabin for hours, and they had watched from the trees during the day. I would never know what they wanted, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If I had stayed one more night, they might not have just been watching anymore.